Sam Coates is here. Sam, you've got the document. You're able to show us some of it. What are the bits that you're picking out and that you're finding?
So just shy of 150 pages. Here it is. Here, I'm going to show you, first of all, the two-page vetting document released. It was prepared, official sensitive, it says at the top, in the secrecy for Downing Street, for Keir Starmer. So what are the risks that the process, the due diligence process highlighted about Peter Mandelson? How big a risk did they make out him to be? I think we can go through that document now. So if you look at it, you can see the bits in bold here. Are the bits that they are flagging to the Prime Minister. The Whitehall machine is flagging to the Prime Minister could well be things he needed to concern himself with. So look at the top one. He has a lot of public speaking and writing engagements. So they are saying that would have to cease. That was the top concern that was listed to the Prime Minister. The second concern was the fact that Peter Mandelson was president of a company called Global Counsel. Now, Global Counsel was a consultancy set up by Peter Mandelson. It had a range of clients all around the world. And it says here, reputational risks could occur relating to any of these clients dealing with the UK or the US government. Global Counsel did not declare any lobbying clients under the last quarter of the Sunak administration. Media reporting is noting the group's expansion since the election. So there is a worry there that there are clients maybe the government doesn't know about that could have commercial interests. Could there be ties to Peter Mandelson? So that is the kind of thing that is being highlighted to Keir Starmer. Of course, Global Counsel very recently wound up as a result of all of the scandal brought on it by the fact that Peter Mandelson was its president. Amongst the high-profile clients of that group, TikTok, Shell, Accenture, the Premier League, and so on. Right, let's look at the next risk. They say the retained role and interest in Global Counsel would have to cease if appointed ambassador. So what that's saying is there appears to be a suggestion that at one stage Peter Mandelson wanted to keep his retained role and interests in Global Counsel, but was made to give it up. Some others in government allowed to keep their shareholdings in Starmer's government, but that not being the case here today. Let's look at other things highlighted in the key critical risk assessment. Here we go. Roles in financial services companies. The due diligence document says, to note, he may have to resign financial services roles pending conflict of interest assessments by the FCDO and the diplomatic service regulations. And then it goes into a bit of the background because, as I think everybody watching will know, Peter Mandelson, not an uncontroversial figure. So the document does note that he twice resigned as a Labour minister in the Blair and Brown administrations. So we can see all of that, but no mention yet of Jeffrey Epstein. So let's go and see that. And before we get to the Epstein section, it says to note general reputational risk around previous departures from the new Labour governments, both relating to the financial matters and high-profile donors to government. So what that bit is saying is, watch out, he's got a reputation, he's got a record. We have to be alert to that, particularly when it comes to financial matters and his connection to high-profile donors in government. But none of that was the thing that ultimately meant that Peter Mandelson had to resign. That was his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. It's worth going through in some detail, so just bear with me for a minute or so as I take you through what Keir Starmer was told about the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Here it starts. A 2019 report commissioned by JP Morgan found that Epstein appeared to maintain a particularly close relationship with Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and Lord Peter Mandelson, a senior member of the British government. So here we have it on the face of the documents. Keir Starmer absolutely told up front that he had a close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. The report cited Epstein's personal records, which showed contact beginning in 2002 and continuing throughout the 2000s. Now, you'll note that a lot of the controversy is whether or not Keir Starmer knew, which we think he did, that Peter Mandelson maintained a close relationship after Jeffrey Epstein's conviction for sex trafficking. So look at the next bit. After Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, their relationship continued, across this, 2009 to 2011, beginning when Lord Mandelson was business minister and continuing after the end of the Labour government. Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in 2009. There you have it. there you have it, in black and white. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, warned in the clearest possible terms that Peter Mandelson maintained his relationship after the conviction, and that relationship was close. He was accepting, there were reports that he was accepting hospitality. There is no escape from this. Keir Starmer knew a lot at the point in December 2024 when he appointed Peter Mandelson. Let's keep going. It says in 2014, Mandelson agreed to be a founding citizen of the Ocean Conservation Group founded by Ghislaine Maxwell and funded by Epstein. So another post-conviction, post-jailing link that was brought to the Prime Minister's attention. On reporting of the JP Morgan report, Lord Mandelson's spokesman said, Lord Mandelson very much regrets, so this is the response of Lord Mandelson to all of this. Lord Mandelson very much regrets having ever been introduced to Epstein. This connection had been a matter of public record for some time. He never had any form of professional or business relationship with Epstein in any form. And then it goes on to talk about some of the official statements, including that from the Labour Party. It also says the Cabinet Office holds official records that are likely to be released by the National Archives early next year, so that would have been 2025 last year, which relate to Tony Blair meeting with Epstein that was facilitated by Mandelson. So I'm sure there'll be some more focus on that. And then in glorious civil servant understatement, it simply says, in conclusion to all of that, to note, general reputational risk. The report.
To pause there because there's so much to go through.
There certainly is.
Fascinating detail that you're giving us here. We're going to go back to Beth for a couple of minutes just to reflect on what we've just heard there, because Sam spelled out the general concerns that the Cabinet Office were aware of: speaking arrangements, his relationship with Global Counsel, roles in the financial service, twice resigned from Labour. But the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and as Sam said, this is really clear. This is something that the Prime Minister has intimated that he wasn't aware of, but this is clear in black and white. The Prime Minister had been warned in this Cabinet Office document about Jeffrey Epstein's close relationship with Mandelson whilst he was in government.
Exactly. What that is going through there is this due diligence report by the Cabinet over the appointment of Peter Mandelson, and we did expect that report to include that story from the Financial Times, which revealed this post-conviction, Epstein did, quote, maintain a particularly close relationship with Epstein, and that he stayed in the Manhattan townhouse while Epstein was in prison. And we knew that that was going to be in the report, but seeing it in black and white, that the Prime Minister was told about this, was warned about this, and also the due diligence report stating quite clearly that the appointment of Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the US found there was a general reputational risk, that's in quotes, over his relationship with the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. So what we are learning from this is what we knew, but actually to see it there, that the Prime Minister, knowing about the general reputational risk, knowing about the continued relationship, that he put him into post anyway. And that is going to play very, very badly, particularly with his female MPs who were absolutely furious over the Mandelson revelations. I mean, Harriet Harman has talked extensively on our podcast about working with Mandelson in previous administrations and how she was very clear that he should never have been reappointed. And I think that the fact that the Prime Minister was clearly warned about this relationship and still proceeded is going to be deeply, deeply uncomfortable for him. And as I said, the other thing that's very clear in this report, which is very newsworthy, is that Lord Mandelson received a £75,000 severance payment when he was sacked, as the government just sought to get him out of office. He'd asked for over £500,000, and that was approved by David Lammy. We also have the fact that, and this is where some of the Prime Minister's former aides who have now left Downing Street, we've also, it makes clear in this report that Morgan McSweeney, his former Chief of Staff who resigned last month, and Matthew Doyle, his former Director of Communications, discussed this relationship, and they were both satisfied. It's also turning up in this report that Peter Mandelson had suggested that using Nigel Farage to better UK connections with the Trump administration. So part of the reason some would say that Mandelson was put back into this role was because they thought that Lord Mandelson, who'd been a former trade advisor in the European Union, and obviously a very experienced politician who was very well connected, that he might be able to manage and handle Trump. So that was some of the considerations that were made, putting him back into government, having been sacked, I should say, twice from government in his previous incarnations in the former Labour administrations under Blair and then Brown, that he suggested using Nigel Farage. Well, given the animosity between the Prime Minister and Nigel Farage, I think that that would be something that the Prime Minister would absolutely not want at all. But clearly, the top line from this at the moment is that the Prime Minister, knowing that there was a general reputational risk over Mandelson's relationship with Epstein and being presented with all the evidence about an ongoing relationship, that he put him into post. His defence will be, I asked followed-up questions and Peter Mandelson lied to me. That will be what he says. He said in the Commons, I regret appointing him. This is the Prime Minister. If I knew then what I know now, he would never have been anywhere near government. He said that he fell for Mandelson's lies. None of us knew the depth of the darkness of that relationship. He had portrayed Epstein as someone he barely knew. That was the Prime Minister's defence. But what you see in that document is he clearly was told, and that is deeply, deeply difficult.
Beth, pause now and we'll bring Sam back in. Sam, Beth was talking about the severance pay just a few moments ago, the $75,000 that he was offered. You've got a bit more on what he'd actually asked for.
So here we go. This is a document from essentially October last year. You can see the date on the screen. I'll enlarge it a little bit so you can see it a little bit more closely. And you've got a message there from between two officials. And it talks about the fact that Peter Mandelson, who is the he in this email, opened negotiations asking us to pay out his contract, which was worth over £500,000, £500,000. Mark did very well to get this settlement down this low with minimal fuss. What was the settlement in the end? Well, here is a message. Here is a letter from James Murray, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, on the 6th of October last year. And here he is making the formal application for what's known as a special severance payment for about £75,000. So £40,000 of that was for 3 months' notice, plus a termination payment of just shy of £35,000. All of that, I think, deeply awkward. In the end, Peter Mandelson left that job because of the depth of his relationship with one of the most notorious paedophiles in the world, and the fact that the Prime Minister was saying publicly he didn't know the scale of the relationship at the time of the appointment. Right, I just want to take you over to one more thing. This is the box, what's called a box note. What that is it's the document that's submitted. It's another one of the documents submitted directly to the Prime Minister about the appointment of Peter Mandelson. So we're going back to pre-appointment here. And let me just take you through, and I'll enlarge it a little bit so you can see it, and we'll highlight the key bits. It says, you've been discussing the appointment of the HMA, which means His Majesty's Ambassador, of the Washington Ambassador job, and have received advice previously on the routes that you could pursue, either official or a political appointee, and you've expressed a preference for Peter Mandelson. We have sought a due diligent effort from the Propriety and Ethics team, which is enclosed, and your Chief of Staff has discussed Peter's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which we will go through for you. So there we have, I'm going to highlight that there. So Morgan McSweeney, then Chief of Staff, is in black and white recorded to have discussed Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which they were going to go then take them through. What's the point of that? Well, the difficulty of that for Keir Starmer is that there was no uncertainty that this was a massive political issue. In black and white, this was a top concern of the then Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, about that appointment of Peter Mandelson. And what it then says is that the then Director of Communications is satisfied with his responses to the questions about the contact. So there was an individual back then who was Director of Communications. His name was Matthew Doyle. He was a figure on the same wing as Peter Mandelson, a friend of Peter Mandelson, recently elevated to the House of Lords, but since suspended from the Labour Party. And he waved through this appointment, saying that he was satisfied with Peter Mandelson's responses, and Morgan McSweeney then clearly was as well. So you can see that, as it were, to put it in much cruder terms, all of the key figures around Keir Starmer were dipping their hands in the blood here and were recorded as having done so. They knew that the political question about appointing Peter Mandelson was his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. They went out of their way to do due diligence, and having seen what they saw, they waved it through, even though, as we saw from the earlier document, that due diligence included the knowledge that Peter Mandelson was hanging around with Jeffrey Epstein post-conviction and soliciting hospitality from him. That, I think, goes to the heart of the challenge that Keir Starmer will find in the coming weeks and months as he tries to defend his original decision to appoint Peter Mandelson.
Sam, thanks very much. Sam's co-host on Politics at Sam and Anne's is Anne McElroy. She's the executive editor at Politico, and she joins us now. What's your reaction, Anne, to what you've heard so far?
Well, it's really interesting listening to Sam there running us through in detail what we now know happened, or the tone and the omissions of the appointment of Peter Mandelson. And I have to say, it does not look good at all for Keir Starmer. I think there was a line that he could run when this all came into the public domain, which was essentially that he was lied to, that Peter Mandelson had buried the truth of the extent of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But as we saw there were lots of mentions of it. There's a lot of fretting about it. There's a lot of talk about reputational risk. So the question is, why did Keir Starmer, having seen that there was reputational risk, or heard it secondhand from Morgan McSweeney, from his chief of staff, who seemed to be pushing for the appointment, why did he not pause about it? Did he not think it's important enough to pause on? Though, of course, he is effectively now saying that he does accept that it was an important and a very bleak connection that Peter Mandelson had with someone he had already got a conviction for sex with an underage girl. So I think there's a disjuncture between saying I was lied to, but actually I knew all along what I was being lied to about. Maybe I didn't know enough. But that's still quite damning, isn't it?
And in terms of the amount that he asked in severance pay, £500,000, it's quite eye-watering.
That is. I mean, I think he's obviously arguing it as if it were a corporate contract. You contracted, and ambassadors are contracted for a certain amount of time, but he's not. Peter Mandelson was not, by pushing this and sticking his neck out there, it was not taking into account the circumstances, or that he was basically being pushed out in shame, and is this rather hoity-toity tone. And he says, I expect to be flown, my re-entry to the UK should be handled to give me the most dignity in these circumstances. I'm still a servant of the crown. I mean, the money is eye-watering. Of course, that's what people will notice. And it's interesting that there was an immediate pushback, and you must be kidding. I mean, it doesn't quite say that in the files in Foreign Office speak, but it nearly does. And you're 75,000 or so, and that's your lot. But also that tone and the entitlement, I think that will sit very badly. And
and we're going to pause you there because Darren Jones is on his feet in the Commons.
UK for the public. There are further tranches of documents to come as officials work through the humble address's full scope. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to recognise the strength of feeling on all sides of the House, my own included, of the disgust and horror at the nature and extent of the relationship that Peter Mandelson maintained with Jeffrey Epstein, despite his criminal conviction for abusing a vulnerable young girl, including encouraging Jeffrey Epstein to then fight that conviction. Jeffrey Epstein was a despicable criminal who committed the most horrifying and disgusting crimes that destroyed the lives of countless women and girls. What he did is, of course, unforgivable, and his victims, I know, will be in the thoughts and prayers of all members across this House as we debate these issues today. Those victims will always be our first priority, and Peter Mandelson's behaviour was an insult to them and their suffering. And can I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I am therefore sorry that these events leave those victims with no choice but to relive their horrors with still too little justice being served. That is why there is, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, a cross-party consensus in this House for full transparency and accountability, why anybody with knowledge must cooperate with inquiries, whether in the United Kingdom or elsewhere, and why the government is therefore committed to publishing all documents relevant to the humble address. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has taken responsibility for Peter Mandelson's appointment as ambassador to the United States. He has acknowledged it was a mistake and has apologised, not least for believing Peter Mandelson's lies. As the government has said previously, there are specific documents that this government would like to have been able to disclose today, but which the Metropolitan Police have asked us not to do so yet, in order to avoid prejudicing their ongoing criminal investigation into Peter Mandelson. We have agreed to that request. We will therefore publish these documents in the future as soon as the Metropolitan Police have confirmed it will no longer prejudice their investigation. The government must, as the House already understands, also carefully assess the risk of prejudicing UK national security or international relations posed by the release of any official documents. Any such material will and is being referred to the Intelligence and Security Committee of this House. I thank the committee for their assistance in this matter and can confirm to the House that the committee has agreed with a limited redaction requested by the government in relation to one document that we are publishing today. Outside of this arrangement, this process does not change the important and well-established constitutional principle that national security and international relations judgments are ultimately for the government. Madam Deputy Speaker, on today's release, the documents specifically relate to the decision to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States and the discussions that subsequently led to his dismissal. These include the Cabinet Office due diligence report, which was passed to number 10 prior to Peter Mandelson's appointment, information provided to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, regarding whether full due process was followed during Peter Mandelson's appointment. Papers relating to Peter Mandelson's appointment as His Majesty's Ambassador to the United States, and minutes of meetings relating to the decision to appoint him, and details of the severance payments made to Peter Mandelson after the Prime Minister instructed he be withdrawn as ambassador, thereby terminating his employment by the civil service. Whilst the documents point to public reports of an ongoing relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, the advice did not expose the depth and extent of their relationship, which only became apparent after the release of further files by Bloomberg and then the United States Department for Justice. After the Prime Minister reviewed the Cabinet Office due diligence that noted public reporting on Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, questions were put to Peter Mandelson by advisers in number 10, as Right Honourable and Honourable members can see referred to on pages 8 and 94 of the bundle, and Peter Mandelson responded. These are matters that are currently the subject of an ongoing police investigation, and we will publish this document when the investigation allows. When we do, the House will be able to see Peter Mandelson's answers for themselves, which the Prime Minister regrets believing. Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country. And I reiterate for the House that the Prime Minister deeply regrets taking him at his word. It was a mistake to do so. I can, however, confirm to the House, as agreed with Madam Deputy Speaker and Mr. Speaker, that we have shared the documents that are with the Metropolitan Police, with the Chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, on terms agreed by the Metropolitan Police to ensure as much transparency to this House as is possible. And Madam Deputy Speaker, as soon as the truth became apparent following reporting by Bloomberg, the Prime Minister acted to withdraw Peter Mandelson from his role. I'm sure that Right Honourable and Honourable members across the House will also read in these documents with interest how Peter Mandelson conducted himself after his withdrawal as ambassador. As the documents show, regarding his severance payment, Peter Mandelson initially requested a sum that was substantially larger than the final payment. Not just 2 or even 3 times, but more than 6 times the final amount, despite the fact that he was withdrawn from Washington because he had lost the confidence of the Prime Minister. The government obviously found that to be involving a drawn-out legal claim at the Employment Tribunal, given Peter Mandelson's employment as a civil servant rather than a minister. The House will know that ministers can be dismissed without recourse to the Employment Tribunal. Civil servants are treated differently. The government is committed to complying with the humble address. Further work is ongoing to compile the rest of the information that is in its scope. The government recognises the urgency with which this work must be completed, and the government will, of course, keep members updated as that work progresses. But we know that these documents also reveal that the due diligence process fell short of what is required. We have already taken steps to address weaknesses in the system and to ensure that when standards of behaviour fall short of the high standards expected, that there will be more serious consequences. We have launched the Ethics and Integrity Commission to promote the highest standards in public life. And we are changing the process for direct ministerial appointments, including politically appointed diplomatic roles, so that where the role requires access to highly classified material, the candidate must have passed national security vetting before such appointments are announced or confirmed. Ministers will now be expected to forego severance payments following a serious breach of the ministerial code, and we have given the independent advisor the power to initiate investigations into ministerial misconduct without the need to seek the Prime Minister's permission first. The Prime Minister has also strengthened the ministerial code with stricter rules on gifts and hospitality, and we have asked the Lords Conduct Committee to review the Code of Conduct to consider what changes are required to ensure that peers can be removed when they've brought the House into disrepute in the other place. We are also exploring whether the committee can tighten rules on lobbying and paid advocacy to bring the Lords in line with the Commons procedures. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to note that the vast majority of individuals who apply to public service do so with the best of intentions. However, it is right that following the Peter Mandelson case, we ask questions about how we can further strengthen the rules and processes that underpin the operation of government. And we have appointed Baroness Anderson of Stoke-on-Trent in the other House to support this work on standards and constitutional reform as a new minister in the Cabinet Office. I can also announce that the Prime Minister has asked the Ethics and Integrity Commission to conduct a review of the current arrangements relating to financial disclosures for ministers and senior officials, transparency around lobbying and the business appointment rules. And we are conducting a review of the national security vetting system to ensure we learn the lessons from the policy and process weaknesses related to Peter Mandelson's case. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me conclude by reiterating that the whole House will agree that Jeffrey Epstein was a disgusting individual, and Peter Mandelson's decision to put their relationship before his victims and the vulnerable is reprehensible. As the Prime Minister has said, the victims of Epstein have lived with trauma that most of us can barely comprehend. They've had to relive it again and again, and they have had to see accountability delayed and too often denied. We must all learn this hard lesson and end a culture which dismisses women's experiences far, far too often and too easily. Peter Mandelson should never have been appointed, and the government will comply with the humble address. I will update the House further in due course, and Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend the statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for your remarks at the outset. of this statement. I do thank the Minister for advance sight of the statement that I received at 1:30. But I will note that this whole business is really about transparency. And the fact is that the government has had to be dragged to do this by members of this House, by members on both sides of this House. And so to produce a 135-page document and put it online 23 minutes before this debate is really not acceptable at all. And I do respect the Chief Secretary coming and doing this himself, but it really ought to be the Prime Minister sitting there, because all of this is about the Prime Minister's judgment. And so it's very convenient that this document was published after Prime Minister's questions today, when the man who made the decision, the man whose judgment is in question, could have been put under scrutiny by honourable members. There are very many questions that arise from the documents published right now. I will put a few on record and then I will return to the central theme. There is the issuance of severance pay, which the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister referred to. Why did ministers agree to any severance pay, given what had happened? I think a lot of our constituents will be disgusted that Peter Mandelson received £70,000. Will Peter Mandelson's full declaration of interests that he is supposed to have handed over when he was appointed be published? I don't believe that they are included in the tranche today. Is this because of a police request, or is it for some other reason? Will the Chief Secretary publish a register of withheld and delayed documents so that the House can be aware of what is being held back? And will he give us a little more information, either now or in the future, on redactions? It is important that this House understands who is deciding on what will be redacted. This awful saga involving Jeffrey Epstein continues. I understand that as this House meets, one of his ranches in New Mexico is being investigated because there are reports that bodies are buried there. At the centre of this scandal was a very rich and powerful man who despicably abused his position, and he was helped to become rich and powerful by his associates. One of those associates was Peter Mandelson. So while, of course, I associate myself with the remarks made by the Chief Secretary about Epstein's victims, it's very clear that those victims were not in the Prime Minister's mind when he appointed Peter Mandelson. The Prime Minister has already admitted that he knew Mandelson had maintained his friendship with Epstein even after the latter's conviction for his terrible crimes. That was a bad choice, and it's a choice that we can now read about in black and white, Madam Deputy Speaker, on page 11, where the Prime Minister was told after Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, their relationship continued across 2009 to 2011, beginning when Lord Mandelson was business minister and continuing after the end of the Labour government. Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in 2009. Now, the Prime Minister claims that he was lied to. He wasn't lied to by this due diligence document. And it may be that Mandelson denied these claims. And if so, maybe the Prime Minister was lied to. But he was lied to by an inveterate liar who had been fired twice before. And we're supposed to believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Prime Minister, who was once the chief prosecutor in this country, couldn't see through this nonsense. It beggars belief. Over the coming hours and days, we'll see whether these documents reveal why the Prime Minister's judgment failed so badly. But we must suspect that it was because his then Chief of Staff was Mandelson's protégé. And Morgan McSweeney had set up Labour Together, the Prime Minister's private campaigning organisation, and Peter Mandelson had advised Morgan McSweeney on the establishment of that organisation, and that organisation had been responsible for breaking electoral law so that it could hide the sources of its funders from the public and from the Labour Party. And then Labour Together had sought to intimidate and smear journalists who revealed that wrongdoing, and it provided hundreds of Labour MPs and many of the top brass in the Cabinet with free money and free services. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the ultimate job for the boys. The Prime Minister knew all he needed to know. It was on him. It's on him now. He let his party down, he let his country down, and I very much doubt that either will trust him again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy asked me a number of questions, which I will take in turn. The first was on severance payment. He asked me, Madam Deputy Speaker, why that payment had been made and who approved it. As I set out in my opening statement, Peter Mandelson was employed as a civil servant, not as a minister. That meant that on his summary dismissal by the Prime Minister, he had the right to take a claim to the Employment Tribunal. As you can see in the documents, Peter Mandelson asked for a much larger sum with the implied threat that that would be taken through legal proceedings with associated legal costs. The government, wouldn't have wanted to pay £1 to Peter Mandelson. But in contrast to the cost to the taxpayer of Employment Tribunal legal fees and maybe a payment that in the advice would have been higher than the amount that was given, the government reluctantly agreed to that award. The Prime Minister has since said that Peter Mandelson should either return that money or donate it. On the question of who approved the severance payment, the House will see from the documents that the request from the Foreign Office was made to the Treasury. The payment was approved in line with Treasury business rules, albeit reluctantly, and with an express condition that a non-disclosure agreement was not allowed in these circumstances. And for the sake of completeness, there is reference in the bundle to that business case requiring my approval, and I can confirm to the House I did not receive that request or indeed approve it. The Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster asked me then about some of the documents, namely about redactions and a register of withheld documents. On the question of a register of withheld documents, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would need to take that away to take advice from lawyers in the Metropolitan Police to be able to say whether these documents are being held for their criminal investigation or not. I hope that the House is somewhat reassured by the mechanism we have been able to establish with the chair of the Select Committee, who has sight of these documents, albeit in a contained and controlled way. Redactions in the documents that are made by government are only to protect the names and contact details for junior civil servants, as is due practice. Other redactions that relate to international security and international relations are done with the approval of the Intelligence and Select Committee. He lastly asked me about the report from the Cabinet Office to the Prime Minister. As I've said in my opening statement, the Prime Minister did ask subsequent questions of Peter Mandelson following that report being submitted by the Cabinet Office. These questions were undertaken by his advisers in number 10. And whilst this is a document that we can't publish at this time, the Prime Minister is very clear that he regrets having believed the lies that Peter Mandelson put before him.
Rachel Maskell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, clearly Peter Mandelson's associations bring a real stench to the appointment processes, but I want to know about the business associations and the way that they are scrutinised within the process, because clearly we know that Peter Mandelson's PR company, Global Counsel, had strong associations, a client in fact, Palantir, who has won lucrative contracts from successive governments. I want to understand if the papers demonstrate those associations and the associations that Peter Mandelson then brought into government.
My honourable friend will see from the documents being published today that those commercial interests were raised by the Cabinet Office and established processes were put in place where new members of the civil service have to remove those commercial interests before taking office. And there is some commentary in the bundle about the conversation with Peter Mandelson in advance of his appointment as Ambassador to the United States, specifically about that question. Having said all of that, part of the review that we are now taking forward is another look at the business appointment rules to make sure that the processes that were applied in these circumstances are robust enough in the situation in which we're discussing. And if we need to further strengthen them, we stand ready to do so.
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Well, Darren Jones there giving the government's response to the release of this tranche of documents about Peter Mandelson and his appointment as US ambassador. Let's return to our political editor, Beth Rigby, here. So, Beth, we've had a chance to digest it for a few minutes. What are the highlights, do you think? What are the most important facts that have come out of this?
Well, I think the most important thing that is coming out of this is something that everyone knew, but now you're seeing it in black and white, and that's the extent to which Keir Starmer was warned about Peter Mandelson's relationships with Epstein ahead of that appointment. The documents are revealing that the Prime Minister was warned if anything goes wrong, you could be more exposed as the individual is more connected to you personally, that he was warned that Mandelson's relationship with Epstein lasted until 2011, and he was imprisoned for soliciting a minor for prostitution back in 2008 and jailed. It makes clear that the Prime Minister was shown that report or summary of it in the Financial Times about Peter Mandelson staying at the Manhattan townhouse of Jeffrey Epstein whilst he was imprisoned. It talks about Mandelson, and it talks also about what happened with the Prime Minister's staff, about Matthew Doyle, his Director of Communications, being satisfied with the appointment, Morgan McSweeney, his Chief of Staff, discussing the Epstein relationship with the then Director or former Chief of Staff, Matthew Doyle. And it also suggests that Jonathan Powell, his national security advisor, found the appointment process unusual and rushed and worried about reputation to McSweeney. Morgan McSweeney said the issues had been addressed. So really at the heart of it, and I've got it here now, which is this due diligence report. At the heart of it, what you can see clearly is that the Prime Minister was warned and he pressed ahead anyway. Now, what the Prime Minister would say and what Darren Jones said in his defence in the House of Commons is that there is subsequent information to come out that cannot come out at the moment, which details follow-up questions that the Prime Minister and his team made to Peter Mandelson following this due diligence report. And at the heart of this, the Prime Minister saying, I was lied to and I regret believing those lies. Now, that information cannot come out at the moment because of the Metropolitan Police investigation into Peter Mandelson. And Darren Jones there said of the Prime Minister in the Commons, the PM has taken responsibility for Peter Mandelson, his appointment as ambassador to the United States. He's acknowledged it was a mistake and apologised. He then says the documents point to public reports of an ongoing relationship, which is basically what's disclosed in this due diligence report. The advice did not expose the depth and extent of their relationship. But as you heard Alex Burkhardt there reply on the Conservative benches, he said Peter Mandelson was a liar and the Prime Minister was lied to by a liar who had lied twice before, referring to his two resignations from government under Blair and then Brown. And he says, we are meant to believe a Prime Minister who was Director of Public Prosecution could not see through it. It beggars belief. And he said he let his party down, his country down. I doubt they will trust him again. So that was Alex Burkhardt's response to Darren Jones's explanation. I don't need to tell you, Jane, that this is very, very difficult for a Prime Minister, knowing, being told there was general reputational risk, warning that the relationship lasted beyond Epstein's incarceration, that it carried on. It's really uncomfortable for the Prime Minister, also for the government, that he received £75,000 in a severance payment. They're making the argument, well, he asked for $500,000. I mean, that will be something that I have no doubt will prompt fury from people.
Beth, thanks very much for that for now. Let's get some more reaction from Donald McIntyre. Now, he's the author of Peter Mandelson's biography. And Donald, we've heard all about this laid out clear and black and white. Darren Jones there in the House of Commons saying the Prime Minister that Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country, despite what was known about him. What is it about him as a person that inspires such loyalty that allowed him to get back into government after losing positions twice in the past?
Well, his ability, I suppose, to traditionally, I mean, even ever since he became head of communications for the Labour Party, he's been good at convincing, with some justice, certainly in his early career, leaders of the party, prime ministers successively, that's Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and to some extent, it seems, Keir Starmer, that he's a very useful asset, that he can read, events coming ahead. He obviously prided himself on his ability to get on with Donald Trump. And he's a very, very persuasive character. I mean, I should say that none of this excuses what happened. I'd just add very quickly, Jen, if I may, that I think there are really two overlapping issues here for Starmer. One is that, obviously that Cabinet Office due diligence report in the main states what we basically already knew, namely that Keir Starmer appointed Peter Mandelson in full knowledge that his relationship with Epstein had continued after Epstein's first conviction in 2008. But secondly, and here I think we're sort of less well informed by the documents that so far released, Starmer is basically saying, okay, I did know that, but I didn't know about the depth of the relationship. And he lied persistently about that. Now, I mean, the nature of those lies hasn't, it seems, well, as Beth Rigby was saying, really hasn't been exposed, ostensibly because the Metropolitan Police have put restrictions on the files that can be released. But, I mean, did, for example, the Prime Minister himself ask Mandelson what else there was about this relationship that might be damaging? And, quite honestly, there's no evidence that he did. It seems that he left it to Morgan McSweeney, who was a close ally of Peter Mandelson.
Yeah, indeed, and Matthew Doyle as well, as Director of Communications.
Yeah,
the severance pay, the eye-watering sum that Peter Mandelson asked for, are you surprised at this request from him, the kahunas on him, really, to ask for that much money?
Well, I mean, it's certainly, evidence of Mandelson's chutzpah. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I mean, it's pretty disgraceful. And I understand also why Alex Burkhardt is asking why any severance payment at all was made. The only thing I would say about that is that I did detect to some extent an attempt by the Chief Secretary to sort of swing the spotlight back on Mandelson's misdemeanors, which is fair enough up to a point. But I mean, what we're really discussing here is the Prime Minister's judgment in appointing him in the first place. So, I mean, yeah, it was pretty disgraceful, but it's not absolutely central to the argument now about Keir Starmer's wisdom in appointing him.
Donald McIntyre, really great to get your thoughts today. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's cross to Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor, who's been going through this huge pile of documents. You've got a sort of telephone directory sat next to you there, Sam, haven't you? What are you able to highlight for us?
OK, this is it. It's just shy of 150 pages, the release from government in the last hour or so. And really seeing so much of what Keir Starmer knew in advance is the point of today. Let's take you straight to this. This is the due diligence document that was handed to Keir Starmer just before his appointment. And you can see the risks that were raised by various figures who were there just at the moment where just before he was appointed. So look at this. Here, Global Counsel, Peter Mandelson's existing role, president of a big lobbying firm, or his shareholdings, or the fact that he was twice resigned as a Labour minister. It's not till the second page until we get to the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But a large chunk of the second page of the due diligence document has it in black and white. And it says that Epstein had continuing relations, starting contact with Jeffrey Epstein in 2002. You can see that there. And then continuing throughout the 2000s. If I just pull it out a bit, you can see all of this. After Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, their relationship continued across 2009 to 2011, beginning when Lord Mandelson was business minister. And here is the key bit that we want to highlight. Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in June 2009. Why was that sentence alone clearly presented to the Prime Minister not enough to be a red flag that would suggest that he shouldn't have done that appointment? And you can see in classic civil servant understatement to note general reputational risks. Now, This has been presented as something that Keir Starmer and his team were all in favour of. But what's this? Let's look at another document I've come across, and it's a discussion with Matthew Doyle, who was in favour of it. But he highlights that the biggest political foreign affairs voice of all in number 10, Jonathan Powell, was here. Look at this language. Particularly cautious about the appointment. Let's look at what Jonathan Powell told an investigator, a lawyer, about this. He said that he raised concerns about the individual and reputation of Peter Mandelson to Morgan McSweeney, and he found the appointment process unusual, weirdly rushed, and suggested that it wasn't done in a proper way. So, far from being the case that Peter Mandelson was the subject of unanimous agreement in number 10, Keir Starmer's most senior foreign affairs advisor was going, I've got reputational concerns about the appointment, and yet it went ahead. Now look at this. This is going to be particularly embarrassing today. It's the documentation that reveals that the severance payment to Lord Mandelson after he was sacked in September 2024 to 5 topped £75,000. But what's this? This is how much he wanted. We discover from the the HR department of the Foreign Office, we discover that Peter Mandelson was asking for his whole contract to be paid out, over £500,000. There you've got it there, over 500k. That is the scale of the embarrassment the government could have been facing today. But I think, Jane, the bottom line is that the due diligence, what you can see on this second page of the due diligence report, putting plainly that Peter Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in June 2009, for that to be there so clearly, so explicitly, and for the Prime Minister to have gone ahead with the appointment. Now, we haven't seen other documentation related to this. There could be more to come out in the coming days. In some senses, Darren Jones hinted that there might be, but that sentence today is the most politically tricky bit of this entire set of disclosures.
Sam, thanks very much. Let's cross to Anne McAvoy, your co-presenter of politics at Sam and Anne's. And Anne, I wonder, what we're hearing, Starmer said yes, despite all these warnings. Why do you think this is? And obviously Starmer's going to say, well, I can't tell you why, because these documents can't be revealed yet until the police have finished their investigation. But I mean, fundamentally, do you think it was that he just thought this man might be a Trump whisperer and I'm going to hold my nose?
It would appear that way, wouldn't it? I think there's another mystery here, and it's not one that is very flattering, I'm afraid, to the Prime Minister, which is there was clearly a lot of to and fro. We're probably getting a bit more granular detail as Sam was taking us through there, that at any point, the Prime Minister could have just been more proactive and said, if this man is supposed to be so important to my operations, to my relationship with Donald Trump, to getting the UK's business done, I should maybe spend a bit more time with him and work through some of this stuff. That is that sense that you often hear as a criticism of the Prime Minister, that he floats above too much. He lets officials, he lets allies, he lets other people get on with things on his behalf. And then when they go wrong, he said, well, I didn't know about that. I thought this was all going to be fine. So I think that will be a criticism that will be a reasonable one that will be made even by people who are not, are always out to get the Prime Minister. The other question, and you refer to it, is why did he feel that Peter Mandelson there was so important? Now, could it be that this relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and what that signified, of course, we now know worse and worse and worse, but we knew quite a lot at the time about his conviction and how terrible and tawdry and shocking that was, that it was a bit like factored in. This is this character. He knows everyone. He knows light and shade. The Trump administration would be kind of disappointed if he didn't know people who were as famous or even infamous as Jeffrey Epstein. I think that is a kind of glaze of cynicism over this. It is not to say that Keir Starmer, I'm sure, is a perfectly upstanding man when it comes to his morality and what he would think about this terrible saga of abuse of women and girls. He wouldn't say that doesn't matter, but for some reason, it fell down the order of priorities for him. It didn't seem to stop him, and it certainly didn't even give him, as it would appear at the moment. I mean, they say, of course, we'll know more when we hear where the police get to in their investigation. But somehow he did not stop and think, hang on, is this really worth doing? Are there more than reputational risks? Is this just something in all conscience that we shouldn't be alongside?
And Anne, what's also not clear is whether or not the Prime Minister himself had a conversation with Mandelson and asked him these questions, or whether the Prime Minister depended on Morgan McSweeney and Matthew Doyle for the answers.
That is, as I say, it doesn't look like he had a lot of personal involvement. And I do find that quite surprising, because one of the reasons that you wanted Peter Mandelson, the way I heard it at the time from allies of the Prime Minister, were that the reason that he didn't exactly boot out Dame Karen Pierce, who's a very illustrious and very well admired and liked ambassador, including in the Trump administration, but he allowed her time to inspire, and she was moved to another big post. But I think in all fairness, anyone who knew that situation, I don't think she would have wanted to leave. There was one big argument that was put by people who wanted Peter Mandelson, which was that it'd be good to have someone the Prime Minister could trust politically. He was a Labour person. Of course, he was not supposed to be there as a Labour politician, but Labour through and through. Peter Mandelson, we heard that from his biographer, Don McIntyre, with you a few minutes ago. So it seems odd to want to have this person so much, but then not want to have a lot of contact with them. And it does make you wonder whether there was always a sense that Keir Starmer wanted this business done, and wanted his then Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, who was advocating to get on with it. Jonathan Powell had been a former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, raising some objections. They weren't the strongest to say something is rushed and odd, but they were things that you might listen to. For whatever reason, Keir Starmer wanted Peter Mandelson, and I still think there is more of an account to give of that. And the other thing is, we haven't. Well, maybe we'll get more as we go, but we haven't really heard the Prime Minister saying, he said he's sorry that it's caused harm and grief, but he hasn't really, I think, absolutely decided how he wants to frame an apology in a more full way for this appointment and for what has happened and the damage that it's undoubtedly done to Labour and his government.
Anne, thank you very much for that. Let's return to our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, we've got a few more lines that have come out of the document, haven't we, in terms of Mandelson seeking advice from a KC on employment law. When the job came to an end, he was clearly worried about that. And also Ollie Robbins from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office pointing out that no one in the Trump administration appeared to have an issue with Mandelson's appointment, which is possibly not surprising.
Well, look, and this is something that has been discussed amongst MPs, but hasn't really been discussed, if you like, publicly or with the Prime Minister, which is all about the questions about whether or not Mandelson's ties with Epstein were overlooked because he was going to be a politically smart appointment in the view of some of those advising the Prime Minister, because as that note that you've just said from the report says, that the permanent secretary, the top civil servant in the Foreign Office, said no one in the Trump administration has had an issue with Mandelson's appointment. We were struggling over the matter of trade wars and tariffs, and he was an expert. He had done this work as a trade commissioner in a previous incarnation. And whether or not some of the links to Epstein were overlooked. This is what some of the women MPs particularly say to me. But look, when you look at the report, I think the difficulty for the Prime Minister is he says his defence is, I didn't know the depth and extent of the relationship. If I knew what I know now, I would never have let him anywhere near government. But look at some of the things it's revealed. It's the Prime Minister's warned that his relationship with Epstein lasted until 2011. That was 3 years after he was imprisoned for soliciting prostitution from a minor. It reveals that the Prime Minister was warned about making a political appointment like Mandelson rather than a diplomatic one, career civil servant or a career diplomat, saying if anything goes wrong, you'll be more exposed as the individual's more connected to you personally. He was told that Mandelson had been a founding citizen of Gazelle Maxwell's Ocean charity funded by Epstein in 2014. And he knew that he'd stayed in his apartment while he was in prison, Mandelson has. So even though we sort of knew in theory that the Prime Minister knew about Mandelson's connections with Epstein, now it's when you see it in black and white, it looks really damning for the PM. OK, Beth, thanks very much.
It's 3 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. Our breaking news this hour, the first set of files relating to Peter Mandelson's appointment as the UK's ambassador to the United States have been released by the government. The files have revealed that Sir Keir Starmer was warned of a general reputational risk over appointing Lord Mandelson due to his relationship with the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. They've also revealed that the Prime Minister's national security advisor found the appointment process was rushed. We've also learned that Lord Mandelson was given a severance payout of £75,000 following his sacking as ambassador, despite asking for more than £500,000. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, joins us now. Beth, what in all of these documents do you think is most difficult for the Prime Minister?
I think what's most difficult for him is his MPs seeing the warnings he was given about the extent of the relationship between Epstein and Mandelson. He was warned, as you said there at the top, of the general reputational risk. Things were flagged to him in this two-page due diligence report about Mandelson's ongoing relationship with Epstein after Epstein had been convicted. Of course, what he did not know at the time of the appointment was the release of extensive emails between Mandelson and Epstein well after Epstein was imprisoned, that they were released by the Department of Justice in the US. These are the Epstein files. And it was at this point it was revealed about the extent and depth of the friendship, emails flying between them. Once Epstein was imprisoned, they remained very close. And then, of course, allegations that Mandelson seems to have leaked market-sensitive, confidential government information when he was serving in the Brown administration. That led to his arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office. So, in fairness to the Prime Minister, these things were revealed after the appointment and they were not made public until the Department of Justice released those files. But the fact that he was appointed in the first place, given some of the risks that were flagged to Keir Starmer, also given that Keir Starmer didn't have a particularly close relationship with Peter Mandelson, it looks really bad on him. And actually, as you were saying at the top of the programme, although you had Morgan McSweeney, his then Chief of Staff, clearly not flagging issues and kind of checking things out and giving the go-ahead, you have got there Jonathan Powell, who his national security advisor, really the man I see on all the planes going around the world with the Prime Minister, navigating all these international relationships that he has, that Jonathan Powell kind of raised some concerns that the process was rushed. That looks like a red flag. Now, what the government said, I'm going to repeat it because Darren Jones said it in the Commons, is that they would argue that this is only a partial release. And that's because there are thousands of documents relating to the Mandelson files. Only some can be released because there is an ongoing police investigation, as I just talked about. And therefore, Starmer and his team will argue, in fact, he said it in the Commons, that there were subsequent questions asked of Peter Mandelson following this two-page due diligence report, and that is the bit we have not seen. We haven't seen how Peter Mandelson answered it. Now, the Prime Minister's defence seems to be, well, he lied to me, but as Alex Burghardt said in the Commons, the shadow to Darren Jones, the Cabinet Secretary, he made the point that if you're Director of Public Prosecutions and a liar lies to you, do you just believe what they say? It beggars belief. So he was saying that's not, you know, I was lied to. Is that really
and also,
a
it's still not clear
defence?
Whether he was lied to, Keir Starmer was lied to, or whether he took the word of his advisors, Matthew Doyle and Morgan McSweeney.
So, and I think that part of this, and this is more the tactile stuff of it rather than the factual stuff, I think what this is also suggesting to me in some ways is that Keir Starmer was a bit of a passenger in this process, right? And I've personally thought that for a while as well, because he has been so angry about Peter Mandelson, but I think part of the anger, personally, I think part of the anger that Keir Starmer has is because he appointed him despite these risks. So he kind of took a passenger type role, and he let his advisors sort it out and advise him, and he took that advice rather than maybe looking over this due diligence report more carefully, stopping and thinking about, well, my reputation on tackling violence against women and girls. Peter Mandelson was twice sacked from government in the past and weighed up those risks and decided perhaps it wasn't worth the risk. He didn't do that. And now he is really paying for that decision that he made to appoint Peter Mandelson.
So whether or not he had that conversation with Mandelson, that fact in itself shows an error of judgment.
Yeah, or whether... Did he have that conversation, or did he ask his chief of staff to have those conversations? I mean, this is the stuff that we don't yet know, and this is the stuff that will come out once they can release these other documents. I have to say, though, Jane, people around government and in Number 10 keep saying to me, once these other documents are released, it will be more favourable for the Prime Minister, but they haven't been released, and what we're going on is what we've been told, and that is that there was due diligence follow-up questions which we haven't seen were asked, and they were answered by Peter Mandelson. You know, but the question is, did the Prime Minister take him on his word? And given his past record, should he have done so?
Enormous question, Sam, Beth. Let's cross to Sam Coates, our Deputy for Little Bledder, who's been going through these files with a fine-tooth comb, haven't you, Sam? What is leaping out at you when you're looking at these?
This, Jane, is a story about documents in a 150-odd report that's been put out on the government website here. It is the start of it. Let's go straight to the most important couple of pages, and it's this. It is the due diligence report handed to the Prime Minister, which shows what he was told in advance. And they focus straight on the conflicts of interest with his commercial life rather than Jeffrey Epstein. There you have the problems that might arise from his presidency of Global Council. It's not until the second page that you get to the really important bit, the bit that led to his downfall. So this is what the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, was told about Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And it charts the relationship from 2002 all the way through the period that Peter Mandelson joined Gordon Brown's government. But then, this is the key bit. After Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein's relationship continued across 2009 to 2011, right the way through his period in government and beyond. And look at this. Here it is in black and white, and there's no escaping from it. Mandelson reportedly staying in Epstein's house while he was in jail in June 2008. So much of this is going to be a question about why that alone wasn't a red flag. There could be more documents to come out. There were definitely more questions asked by the Prime Minister of Peter Mandelson about that, but the appointment went ahead. There were further relationships between Mandelson and Ghislaine Maxwell, who worked with and was often with Jeffrey Epstein. She was Mandelson was a founding citizen of the Ocean Conservation Group. Now, in classic civil service understatement, it just says at that part of the due diligence report, to note general reputational risk. One other thing, it points out in that document that Peter Mandelson had been suggesting Nigel Farage is better used for his connections to the Trump administration. So they knew there were potential political complications on all sorts of different levels. Now, how did this appointment happen? We get quite a lot of clues in the 150 pages. This is a note of a meeting between Keir Starmer's lawyer and the then Director of Communications, Matthew Doyle. And it did talk about how Matthew Doyle and Morgan McSweeney, now both were fans of Peter Mandelson, did have one-on-one conversations about the appointment and how, presumably, they wanted it to go ahead. But Matthew Doyle notes that there were interactions with Jonathan Powell and that Jonathan Powell was particularly cautious about the appointment. So there you've got the most senior foreign affairs advisor to the Prime Minister going, hang on a moment, there might be something wrong. So when Jonathan Powell had his conversation with Keir Starmer's lawyer, what was the consequence of that? Well, there it gets really interesting. Jonathan Powell raised concerns about Peter Mandelson and Peter Mandelson's reputation to Morgan McSweeney. Now, that to me is possibly maybe the second biggest revelation after what was in black and white put before the Prime Minister, that Jonathan Powell, who is the foreign policy guru to Keir Starmer, was going, hang on a moment. Now, Jonathan Powell has known about Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandelson for nigh on 25 years. So if there was anyone with a track record of independent advice and knowledge on Jeffrey Epstein, it would be him. But was he cut out of the process? Because here, Jonathan Powell seems to have been saying, I don't recall any specific meetings on this that I was involved in, and there were very few conversations. And he said that the appointment process was unusual for appointing Lord Mandelson. It was weirdly rushed and not the standard people doing that. So I think that is a pretty big problem. Now, you can see in how many different directions this has ended up being deeply embarrassing. Peter Mandelson stayed in the United States after he was sacked. Why? Because of his dog. As you can see here at the top of this email from Peter Mandelson, he said the dates for my departure are right, given the delay in obtaining his dog Jock's veterinary certificate, and talked about his concern in arriving in the UK with the maximum dignity and minimum media intrusion which he thinks as a civil servant he should be treated with, which is fascinating, difficult, but not as difficult for the government as this. Here is the official letter from James Murray, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, which spells out how much severance pay the Foreign Office had to pay via the Treasury. It's almost £75,000. This was a long-time politician who had to resign because of links to possibly the most notorious paedophile in the world, yet £75,000 of public money had to be paid out. But what's this? We actually have a sense of how much Peter Mandelson was asking for. £500,000. The entire duration of his contract was what was being asked. You can see it in this email between the HR figures in the Foreign Office and others. £500,000, politically unsustainable. It was unclear whether or not Peter Mandelson actually breached his contract, which is why all of this got so tricky. This is difficult. There is no doubt about it for the Prime Minister. Stuff in black and white, his top team, members of his top team saying, I've got concerns, a process that was rushed, but there's more to come, Jane, and that will be key.
Sam, thanks very much. Well, in the past hour, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, gave this statement about it in the Commons.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to recognise the strength of feeling on all sides of the House, my own included, of the disgust and horror at the nature and extent of the relationship that Peter Mandelson maintained with Jeffrey Epstein, despite his criminal conviction for abusing a vulnerable young girl, including encouraging Jeffrey Epstein to then fight that conviction. Jeffrey Epstein was a despicable criminal who committed the most horrifying and disgusting crimes that destroyed the lives of countless women and girls. What he did is, of course, unforgivable, and his victims, I know, will be in the thoughts and prayers of all members across this House as we debate these issues today. Those victims will always be our first priority, and Peter Mandelson's behaviour was an insult to them and their suffering. Whilst the documents point to public reports of an ongoing relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, the advice did not expose the depth and extent of their relationship, which only became apparent after the release of further files by Bloomberg and then the United States Department for Justice. After the Prime Minister reviewed the Cabinet Office due diligence that noted public reporting on Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, questions were put to Peter Mandelson by advisers in number 10, as Right Honourable and Honourable members can see referred to on pages 8 and 94 of the bundle, and Peter Mandelson responded. These are matters that are currently the subject of an ongoing police investigation, and we will publish this document when the investigation allows. When we do, the House will be able to see Peter Mandelson's answers for themselves, which the Prime Minister regrets believing. Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country. And I reiterate for the House that the Prime Minister deeply regrets taking him at his word. It was a mistake to do so. I'm sure that Right Honourable and Honourable members across the House will also read in these documents with interest how Peter Mandelson conducted himself after his withdrawal as ambassador. As the documents show, regarding his severance payment, Peter Mandelson initially requested a sum that was substantially larger than the final payment. Not just 2 or even 3 times, but more than 6 times the final amount, despite the fact that he was withdrawn from Washington because he had lost the confidence of the Prime Minister. The government obviously found that to be inappropriate and unacceptable. The settlement that was agreed was to avoid even higher further costs involving a drawn-out legal claim at the Employment Tribunal, given Peter Mandelson's employment as a civil servant rather than a minister.
Well, we also heard a response from Alex Burkhart for the Conservatives and Ed Davey for the Liberal Democrats.
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Chief Secretary for advance sight of his statement. It is a stain on our nation that we're even having to go through this. It's right that we keep Epstein's victims, survivors and families at the front of our minds. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, marks the first day of Britain's own Epstein files. And for a close friend of Epstein to have been made Britain's ambassador to the United States is a shameful part of this affair that is the Prime Minister's responsibility. It is disappointing that he is not here now to answer for that and his catastrophic failure of judgment with respect to Mandelson. Peter Mandelson's close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the fact that it continued long after Epstein's conviction for child sex trafficking have been reported by both Channel 4 dispatchers in 2019 and the Financial Times in 2023. Has the Prime Minister told the Chief Secretary personally how those reports made him feel and why he still felt it was right to appoint Mandelson anyway? Mandelson's £70,000 payout is an insult to Epstein's victims, and if he had a shred of decency left, he would donate it to charity. But the Chief Secretary's explanation as to why the government made that payout simply won't wash. Madam Deputy Speaker, with a very limited number of documents being released today, the wait goes on for the rest of Britain's Epstein files. That includes the documents related to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, required by the humble address our party passed a fortnight ago. I very much hope the government will get them out as quickly as possible. It has taken 5 weeks from the Mandelson humble address to publication today. So can the Chief Secretary guarantee that the first Andrew papers will be published within the same timeframe by the 31st of March at the latest?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I've said to the House, the Prime Minister regrets having appointed Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States. It was the wrong decision. He's apologised for it. On the question of severance, as I say, the government would not have wanted to give £1 to Peter Mandelson, but it was the quickest way to remove Peter Mandelson as ambassador and a member of the civil service. And as the leader of the Liberal Democrats says, and the government agrees with him, the honourable thing to do would be to donate that money to an appropriate charity. On the question of the humble address, the one that was brought forward by the Liberal Democrats is being managed by the Department for Business and Trade. I know they're working on that now and will come forward with updates in due course. And as I said in my statement, the Cabinet Office will come back with a further tranche of documents in relation to this humble address as soon as possible.
Darren Jones there giving his response to Ed Davey. We've still got Sam Coates here in the studio with us. And Sam, Darren Jones has ended on this point about there will be another tranche of documents. There's going to be more than another tranche of documents. These documents are going to be released in stages, aren't they? Which feels to somebody, I mean, I'm not an astute political operator, but it seems like a way of absolutely prolonging the agony of this for the government, that we're going to keep covering this in the weeks to come every time they release a new pile of these.
Good God, yes. Let me give you just a bit of numerical comparison. Today, the government have published 147 pages on the government website. There are maybe 100,000 pages to come in total. So we have had the tiniest fraction, less than 1%, way less than 1% of what we're going to get. And there is just a sense that there is very little ability of the government to control and restrict what's coming out because of that row in the Commons a month ago, where Keir Starmer was basically bounced by his own side into saying yes to everything apart from stuff on security grounds. And we're getting a sense of what we don't know up front. Look, one of the most damaging things, which we kind of knew but is now in black and white, is the suggestion that Peter Mandelson solicited hospitality from Jeffrey Epstein when he was in jail, right? Now, we have all the way along known that Keir Starmer challenged Peter Mandelson before the appointment on specific elements of the Epstein relationship. And clearly, some of that was in written form. That hasn't come out yet. Now, I'm getting the sense from Downing Street that they think that some of the future disclosures could actually help them explain why, despite in black and white being told about this soliciting hospitality post-conviction, post-jailing, actually it was all right to appoint him. But that's just not in today's document dump. Now, we know some documents held back by Scotland Yard because they might pertain to the ongoing investigation into Peter Mandelson, because the police's concern is not the reputation of the figures inside Downing Street. But is there more to come? Yes, my goodness, there is more to come. This is just really a section on the vetting. If you were wondering what the rest of the pages are, because we've only showed probably a dozen pages up on the screen, it's because it's the cut and paste of endless pages of Peter Mandelson's contract and terms of employment, which frankly are neither here nor there. In other words, a lot of the 147 pages are just mulch, so we're not going to take you through the stuff that's not particularly relevant. But when there's tens of thousands, maybe as much as 100,000 pages, this is going to go on for months.
And Sam, of course, that contract, he was a civil servant. You would expect that would be pretty standard material that they have furnished us with. I mean, do you think the government has tried to get as much out as quickly as they can to try and mitigate the damage caused? I mean, obviously, given that they can't release certain documents because of the fact that the Met has them.
Well, I mean, my judgment today is that it's incredibly painful looking in black and white at what the Prime Minister was told about Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and there is very little of the case for the defence that you would want as a political operation to have got out there. So Downing Street, I suspect, are really straining, probably quite cross in a way that they cannot articulate publicly, with the Metropolitan Police at putting these restrictions on what the government can release. I suspect inside Downing Street, although they can't say it publicly, they feel only part of the story has been allowed to come out because of the police, and they're pretty furious about it. I can tell you, Jane, we've been here before. We've been here before so many times. I remember the Cash for Honours affair in the late 2000s, where Tony Blair's government was furious with the Metropolitan Police for the way that they basically stopped the whole story being told in a way that Downing Street thought would essentially clear their name. The interaction of the police and the top of politics is never, ever pretty, as this Downing Street, like so many others before us, is finding out.
We also saw in the documents about Epstein's relationship with Trump and Nigel Farage. Mandelson suggested Farage should be used to better UK relations with Trump. That's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. If I could encourage us to have a little look at the screen, because while you were talking, I have just pulled that up. Now, this is part of the due diligence that was handed to the Prime Minister before the appointment. This was thought important enough to put in the two-page document that went to the PM. And this was that Lord Mandelson suggested using Nigel Farage to better UK connections with the Trump administration. So they found that from the public domain, these comments, and put them before the eyes of the Prime Minister. Peter Mandelson is quoted saying of Farage, contrary to UK government policy, you can't ignore him. He's an elected member of parliament, he's a public figure, he's a bridgehead both to President Trump and Elon Musk and others. National interest is served in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. So at the point that Peter Mandelson was appointed ambassador, Keir Starmer knew that the man he was putting in Washington was effectively prepared to work with the biggest political challenge in Parliament at that point, Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, the party that at that point, just as today, was leading the polls and presenting a really big political risk for the Labour Party. Yet Peter Mandelson was found to be saying that he provides a potential bridgehead and that you might need to use Nigel Farage in Washington to open doors for Keir Starmer's administration. You've got to say, Anne, a lot of people think that Lord Mandelson's appointment to Washington was a reflection of the need for unusual methods to get the attention, get on side with the Trump administration. It's exactly that kind of unusual method in politics that I suspect will have been seen a potential win at the time. My goodness, none of this will feel like a potential win for this government anymore.
Also clear from the documents that Ollie Robbins in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office said no one in the Trump administration had an issue with Peter Mandelson's appointment. So, Mandelson saying, well, Farage is the Trump whisperer. Do we think that Starmer thought Mandelson was also a Trump whisperer?
So that was the hope, right? The hope was that as the image at the point at which the UK and the US signed the trade deal, Peter Mandelson standing over the shoulder of Donald Trump, that was very much the dream of the appointment here, that Peter Mandelson would be a Trump whisperer, a White House whisperer, and somebody who could speak to the MAGA crew in Washington. I'm not sure that's actually completely how it ended up. My understanding was that Peter Mandelson's relationship with very senior figures in Trump's White House in quite a short period of time actually soured. He had a bust-up and a difficult relationship with Susie Wiles, Donald Trump's chief of staff. He made comments which I think she found condescending when he arrived in Washington, and the relationship never totally got back on the front foot. Peter Mandelson conducted himself like a big figure, would occasionally talk out of turn. My goodness, doesn't Keir Starmer know that now? But also that was true in Washington. That didn't go down as well as they might have expected. So the idea that Peter Mandelson had unique talents that nobody else did, well, there was a very talented ambassador before Peter Mandelson in the form of Karen Pierce, and it doesn't seem that Peter Mandelson's reputation as ambassador was as good, as unblemished, and quite as helpful as everybody needed it to be, given the risk taken with this appointment.
What do you think it tells us about the Prime Minister's judgment?
I mean, look, the really fascinating thing today, and I'm going to pull it back on screen because this, for me, this sentence goes to the heart of it, is that in black and white, in a relatively short submission by the civil service, Keir Starmer was told that Peter Mandelson reportedly stayed at Epstein's house while he was in jail in June 2009. So what we can conclude beyond doubt is that Keir Starmer saw those words. Now, what we don't know is what Keir Starmer did next, but we do know that the appointment then went ahead. And I think the criticism that I think Keir Starmer has faced, not just in relation to the Mandelson appointment, but in relation to things to do with Angela Rayner, other people in his cabinet, his failure to come up with a more coherent policy platform when he came into power, is that he is guilty sometimes of not digging deep enough, of not working quite things through as far as they could do. There's a little bit of a sense in these documents that he's prepared to do hear no evil, see no evil when something complicated comes along. A little bit of subcontracting to the advisors. But here you had something that I didn't know about. Perhaps the biggest fresh revelation for me today is that Jonathan Powell was clearly concerned about the Peter Mandelson appointment, right? Here is a veteran with more years in Downing Street than any of the people who were advising him to go ahead with this. And he was saying, I'm not sure why this appointment process is being rushed. I'm not sure why those people are in charge of it. And I've got all sorts of worries. Jonathan Powell was there getting emails from Peter Mandelson in 2002 saying, I've got this new friend called Jeffrey Epstein, he ought to meet Tony Blair, right? And yet here we are 22 years later, and it's Jonathan Powell going, hang on a moment, guys. And Keir Starmer chooses not to listen to that. And I think, again, we come back to whether or not Keir Starmer is as curious a Prime Minister, truly curious and interested in listening to the things he doesn't want to hear as he needs to be, or whether that might be one of the big flaws of the way he approaches this job. Because he doesn't seem to dig down when there's a complication, lets things fester, and then they come back and sort of whack him. And that just is potentially the story we end up with, the caveat that there is clearly a little bit of the story we haven't seen, held back possibly because of the Metropolitan Police not wanting fresh documentation to enter the public domain. The questions that Keir Starmer put in writing to Peter Mandelson about things like the hospitality, we haven't seen the answer. I mean, people are going to make their mind up politically on the basis of what they have, not what they guess they might get in the future. So that is just the sort of tough luck of politics. But, you know, is Keir Starmer really curious enough about how he goes about things? I think is my big takeaway from what we've learned today.
And you mentioned the Metropolitan Police, this investigation which is underway. He's being investigated. He was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. This is about while he was business secretary in the last Labour government, and about whether or not he sent information to Jeffrey Epstein about selling UK assets, about the EU bank bailout, about bankers' bonuses, leaking private emails as well. In terms of duration, where are we with that? How long do we think it's going to be before we hear anything more from the Metropolitan Police? How long is a piece of string, I suppose?
How quick is the Metropolitan Police? Never that fast. Look, one of the big reasons for that is Peter Mandelson's denial of all these charges, and we ought to just sort of put that up in light. Via his lawyers, Misconduct, Peter Mandelson is making clear that he rejects the charge of criminality linked to leaking documents while he was business secretary to Jeffrey Epstein about the EU bailout because of the financial crisis at the time, or details of exactly how and when Gordon Brown might leave office after the 2010 election. So he says, I reject the charges and I'm going to clear my name. And as well, we ought to say Peter Mandelson has apologised to the victim. So this is contested. So another of the lessons, we were talking about the lessons when politics meets the police, never pretty. Another lesson, always slow. So I can't tell you, because the police are famously opaque in the way that they do things, but I wouldn't expect them to rush to a quick judgment. There has been an incredibly strange episode in relation to Peter Mandelson, in that you will remember just over 2 weeks ago, Peter Mandelson was arrested. Now, we thought he would be interviewed by the police, but he was arrested by Scotland Yard off the back of information from Lindsay Hall, the Speaker, who purportedly told Scotland Yard that he might be a flight risk. Misconduct, Peter Mandelson's lawyers said this is absolutely ridiculous, no evidence for this, absolutely not true. Last week, it appears that that allegation, there might be a flight risk, was rescinded by Scotland Yard. The bail conditions were lifted. Peter Mandelson's passport was handed back to him. I suspect that there is some question in Peter Mandelson's head what on earth Lindsay Hoyle was reflecting when he went to the police. So all of that suggests that we are going quite fast down quite a few different avenues, but the police sort of going in one direction and then sort of retreating a bit. All of that suggests to me that, the police will know right now, Scotland Yard just down the road, it's actually next to the other bit of the Houses of Parliament, opposite the Thames. They will know there is huge reputational risk if they muck this up. Peter Mandelson is possibly one of the biggest figures across 4 decades in our politics. They have chosen to arrest him on a misconduct in public office allegation, and now they are investigating. I think there will be an expectation that they need to see through this, because they have obviously cast a cloud over Peter Mandelson. But is it a cloud that they just find that they cannot prove, or do they take it to the next legal hurdle, which it would be charging? We just don't know. And it is quite clear to me not only from legal statements, but from comments from Peter Mandelson's friends, that he is going to fight this incredibly hard. Both the legal stuff, but also I think Peter Mandelson's still fighting a political battle, not so much to clear his name, which, you know, we can see a lot of the facts in public, but more, I think, the battle that friends of Peter Mandelson is fighting at the moment is just to say there was barely any due diligence done on the appointment in the autumn of 2024 to speak of. If Keir Starmer's going to hide behind documents or hide behind processes, some of those key meetings, those kind of interviews, those vetting interviews to produce those due diligence, I mean, they barely lasted 20 minutes. That's one of the facts that my esteemed colleague Anne McElvoy did on our podcast, Politics and Severance, this morning. You know, some of these vetting meetings were really quite short. The formal vetting process, of course, took place after his appointment, in itself slightly strange. So the question for Keir Starmer comes back to, was he curious enough? Were the processes robust enough? Was the warning something he shouldn't have ignored? And what happens next? And I just come back to the fact, Jane, sorry, not Anne, Jane. We have had...
I wasn't going to pick you up on that.
Fulsome apologies. We have had 147 of the 100,000 pages. There is so much left to come.
It is. It's the tip of the iceberg. Sam, thanks very much. Well, a little while ago, I got reaction on the release of the documents from Peter Mandelson's biographer, Donald McIntyre.
His ability, I suppose, to traditionally, I mean, even ever since he became head of communications for the Labour Party, he's been good at convincing, with some justice, certainly in his early career, leaders of the party, prime ministers successively, that's Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and to some extent, it seems, Keir Starmer, that he's a very useful asset, that he can read, you know, events coming ahead. He obviously prided himself on his ability to get on with Donald Trump. And he's a very, very persuasive character. I mean, I should say that none of this excuses what happened. I'd just add very quickly, Jen, if I may, that I think there are really two overlapping issues here for Starmer. One is that, you know, obviously that Cabinet Office due diligence report in the main states what we basically already knew, namely that Keir Starmer appointed Peter Mandelson in full knowledge that his relationship with Epstein had continued after Epstein's first conviction in 2008. But secondly, and here I think we're sort of less well informed by the documents that so far released, Starmer is basically saying, OK, I did know that, but I didn't know about the depth of the relationship. And he lied persistently about that. Now, I mean, the nature of those lies hasn't, it seems, well, as Beth Rigby was saying, really hasn't been exposed, ostensibly because the Metropolitan Police have put restrictions on the files that can be released. But, I mean, did, for example, the Prime Minister himself ask Mandelson what else there was about this relationship that might be damaging? And, you know, quite honestly, there's no evidence that he did. It seems that he left it to Morgan McSweeney, who was a close ally of Peter Mandelson.
Yeah, indeed, and Matthew Doyle as well, as Director of Communications. Yeah, the severance pay, the eye-watering sum that Peter Mandelson asked for, are you surprised at this request from him, the kahunas on him, really, to ask for that much money?
Well, I mean, it's certainly, you know, evidence of Mandelson's chutzpah. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I mean, it's pretty disgraceful. And I understand also why Alex Burkhardt is asking why any severance payment at all was made. The only thing I would say about that is that I did detect to some extent an attempt by the Chief Secretary to sort of swing the spotlight back on Mandelson's misdemeanors, which is fair enough up to a point. But I mean, what we're really discussing here is the Prime Minister's judgment in appointing him in the first place. So, I mean, yeah, it was pretty disgraceful, but it's not absolutely central to the argument now about Keir Starmer's wisdom in appointing.
That was Donald McIntyre, Peter Mandelson's biographer, talking to me a short while ago. Well, let's now get the thoughts of the political editor at the Financial Times, George Parker. George, your newspaper mentioned in these documents, because of course it was a Financial Times article back in 2023, which laid bare the fact that Mandelson had stayed in Epstein's townhouse in Manhattan in June 2009.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary story back then, broken by my colleague Jim Pickard, about the fact that Peter Mandelson, when he was effectively the Deputy Prime Minister, he was the first Secretary of State, travelled to New York on a private visit and stayed in the £7 million townhouse of Jeffrey Epstein at a time when Jeffrey Epstein was in prison serving a sentence for child sex trafficking offences. That's an extraordinary thing to do when you're a serving minister. And we reported that. There was some follow-up interest a few months later. But the point was, it was in the public domain. It's something that Sir Keir Starmer knew very well about when he came to appointing Peter Mandelson in December 2024.
And George, in terms of what we've heard today, Sam was raising the question, it leads to further questions about whether Keir Starmer was curious enough. What is your take when you've looked at the documents that have been revealed?
When you read the documents, you can see that Jonathan Powell, who's the National Security Advisor for Keir Starmer, also, incidentally, he was the Chief of Staff to Tony Blair throughout the entire 10 years Tony Blair was in Number 10, so he knows Peter Mandelson very well, that he raised concerns about the appointment. And the files say that the appointment was weirdly rushed, which I think is an interesting expression. It seems to suggest that the proper due diligence and vetting wasn't really conducted. And no, I don't think Keir Starmer was inquisitive enough. He delegated it all to his Chief of Staff, now departed Morgan McSweeney. But frankly, he should have been getting across the stuff that was in the public domain and asking, do you want to take a risk on someone whose judgment has been called into question on so many occasions in the past, most recently the one we've just been discussing?
How much damage do you think this is causing Keir Starmer?
Well, look, I mean, I think today a lot of the focus is inevitably still on events going on in the Middle East, and I think a lot of people will have heard a lot of Peter Mandelson. I think the problem is that there's a lot more of this to come, and I think that's the real danger for Keir Starmer. It's very unusual to see in the public domain the way that the inner workings of government operate. And you can imagine there will be emails from Mandelson to people in Number 10 Downing Street criticising Donald Trump, potentially have sort of been quite derogatory about Keir Starmer himself. And I think all of those things potentially are much bigger problems for Keir Starmer coming down the track.
The fact that it's been released just after Prime Minister's questions, do you think that there's criticism from some sides of that, saying that it now means the whole week till the Prime Minister has to answer questions about that? Do you think it's a strategic time to release it?
Yep, almost certainly. Look, I mean, the government could have chosen at any time to release these papers, and to do it 2 hours after the Prime Minister's left the House of Commons, gone back to the safety of 10 Downing Street, is obviously part of that strategy. It also meant, incidentally, that we, as political correspondents, weren't able to question Keir Starmer's spokesman about it immediately after Prime Minister's questions. But nevertheless, there will be acres of newsprint and online coverage devoted to these revelations, because it is just quite an unusual glimpse inside the way the government operates, the back covering that goes on, the internal discussions about why Peter Mandelson was given this sort of a discretionary payment to leave a job where, as you were hearing earlier, lots of people, including the Conservatives, saying, why did he receive a penny? How are we going to explain this to the press? What would happen if we don't do this? Would Peter Mandelson have gone public and caused more trouble? It's really fascinating to see how these decisions were made and people anticipating problems further down the track when these things became public.
Do you think this is really damaging the Labour Party?
Look, I think the Labour Party incurred a lot of damage when this case broke back last September, and subsequent revelations about Peter Mandelson's close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So yes, I think it does damage the Labour Party, but also damages Keir Starmer, doesn't it? It damages his reputation. It damages this idea that Keir Starmer was maybe a bit dull, a bit technocratic, but he knew how to run an organisation. Well, that's been proven beyond doubt to be not correct. Some of his appointments to senior jobs in his government have turned out to be absolute disasters. So yes, I mean it does cause damage to the Labour Party and to Keir Starmer, but there's more damage to come, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how they've released it, I mean, do you think that the questions need to be asked about the fact that they are releasing it in dribs and drabs? Are they damned if they do and damned if they don't? Because I suppose if they'd sat on these documents and released them all in one great big chunk, they would have received criticism for that. But this is possibly the most damaging way to release any kind of set of facts, isn't it?
I think in their dream scenario, they would have just got all of this out in thousands of pages on a single day and let people like me and you sort of trawl through them trying to find nuggets and have one day's bad news. But this is not really within their gift. I mean, I believe them when they say they'd rather get all this out as quickly as possible, just get it out of the way. The problem is, as we know, the Metropolitan Police have raised concerns about the release of some of this information, notably the questions that Morgan McSweeney, the former Chief of Staff, was asking Peter Mandelson about what he knew about Jeffrey Epstein and what Peter Mandelson said in reply. Those aren't included in this document drop today, and that's still got to come down the track. I mean, it may be months or even longer before we see that. So look, it's not entirely in Downing Street's control, but it does guarantee this saga will play out over a long period of time.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be talking about this again. George Parker, the political editor of the Financial Times, thanks so much. Well, let's remind you of that statement that the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, gave in the Commons in the past hour.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has taken responsibility for Peter Mandelson's appointment as Ambassador to the United States. He has acknowledged it was a mistake and has apologised, not least for believing Peter Mandelson's lies. Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country. And I reiterate for the House that the Prime Minister deeply regrets taking him at his word. It was a mistake to do so. I'm sure that Right Honourable and Honourable members across the House will also read in these documents with interest how Peter Mandelson conducted himself after his withdrawal as ambassador. As the documents show, regarding his severance payment, Peter Mandelson initially requested a sum that was substantially larger than the final payment. Not just 2 or even 3 times, but more than 6 times the final amount.
Well, Alex Burkhardt delivered the response on behalf of the Conservatives.
It's very clear that those victims were not in the Prime Minister's mind when he appointed Peter Mandelson. The Prime Minister has already admitted that he knew Mandelson had maintained his friendship with Epstein even after the latter's conviction for his terrible crimes. That was a bad choice, and it's a choice that we can now read about in black and white, Madam Deputy Speaker, on page 11, where the Prime Minister was told after Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, their relationship continued across 2009 to 2011, beginning when Lord Mandelson was business minister and continuing after the end of the Labour government. Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in 2009. Now, the Prime Minister claims that he was lied to. He wasn't lied to by this due diligence document. And it may be that Mandelson denied these claims. And if so, maybe the Prime Minister was lied to. But he was lied to by an inveterate liar who had been fired twice before. And we're supposed to believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Prime Minister, who was once the chief prosecutor in this country, couldn't see through this nonsense. It beggars belief.
Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is sitting alongside me here in Westminster. John, what's been the political fallout of this? What reaction have we seen?
Well, I've been listening to all those exchanges there. That was Alex Burkhardt on the attack for the Conservatives. It beggars belief, you heard him say there, that a former director of public prosecutions was taken in by Mandelson or decided to take the risk. Now, MP after MP said the same thing. They just couldn't believe how the Prime Minister, knowing what he knew revealed in these documents, still decided to go ahead with the appointment. There was plenty of criticism, as you can imagine, of the whole process, the fact that clearly the rules were bent for Mr. Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, as he then was. There was also fury. You heard the reaction there when he talked about the severance payment, $75,000. He asked for $500,000, and there was real anger from lots of MPs about that, and also there was criticism also of the fact that what a character. You heard Alec Burghardt there say he'd been forced to resign as a cabinet minister twice. Committee started by saying that Mandelson was slippery and sleazy. And then we heard from the Labour left-winger Richard Bergen, who have a listen to this and see what comparison that that Mr. Bergen made between the job he got and perhaps another job.
The question that has to be asked is, how did it even get to the stage where the Prime Minister was interviewing Mandelson for this job and considering him for this job? The simple answer is political. It's because it suited the interests of a tiny faction in the Labour Party, funded by big business, who wanted Mandelson at the heart of things in order to shift a Labour government away from the agenda that a real Labour government should have. That's why Mandelson was popular with these people. That's why he was one of their favoured sons. And that's why, despite his despicable character, despite his greed and his avarice, he was put in this position despite what was known. Isn't that the case?
It's not for me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to speak on behalf of Peter Mandelson, but evidently he put himself forward for this role, which is how he ended up in the process in the first place. To the question of his appointment, as I've said to the House, the Prime Minister regrets his appointment and apologises for it, and had he known what the House now knows, he would never have appointed him in the first place.
Now, what we didn't hear was at the beginning of his intervention, Richard Bergen held up one of the documents and said, "You wouldn't get selected as a Labour candidate for a town council if we knew all this about you." And you heard the apology there. That we have time after time after time, Darren Jones said, the Prime Minister regrets the appointment. It was a classic Darren Jones sent out clearly to try and calm things down. He didn't really, because MPs are furious about it on both sides of the House, as we've heard. And no matter how many times Darren Jones issued an apology, MPs left after those exchanges furious and simply couldn't believe that the Prime Minister had gone ahead with this appointment, given everything we've now seen in these documents.
John, thanks very much. Well, given everything that we've seen, Sam Coates is here. He's going through them line by line. What have you uncovered in the last few minutes, Sam?
150 pages of documents. We've got some new information for you, Jen. I want you to look at the screen and look at this. I'll just whiz you through some things we've discovered. First of all, the theme, I think, is, were there too many shortcuts? This is information given to the Prime Minister at the point of his appointment, revealing that Peter Mandelson was a non-executive director of a Russian company and stayed on the board long after the invasion of Crimea. That raises alarm bells. Then you have this, another potential shortcut on the vetting process. Peter Mandelson got the job, was going through vetting, and then look at this. We will brief you further in person from 6th of January onwards, including at the higher tiers. They didn't even wait for Peter Mandelson to get the vetting in order to give him briefing at the highest security levels. That feels pretty remarkable, something that will be picked up in future. Then let's look at how it was all happening. In the room where it happened, where Peter Mandelson was sacked last September, you had David Lammy pleading with the room to make sure that they engaged with the United States government about what was going on to ensure, quote, they understood the context. That's quite something. But look at this. There were also concerns at the very highest level of government, as all these documents, as all these things were being laid out in public, that there were concerns about, effectively, about whether or not here Peter Mandelson might go public, particularly if he didn't reach a settlement. And then a final thing, this is about the depth of concern in government about Mandelson himself. After these documents were promised to be released, there was concern such that there has to be a welfare check, and to do one every day if it's OK for a while. Government officials phoning Peter Mandelson every day at the height of this in February to make sure he's OK. That suggests things went deeply, deeply bad for Peter Mandelson.
It does indeed. Sam, thank you very much for that. Let's bring in legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg, who joins us now to reflect on some of the issues arising from this. And Joshua, of course, nothing released today affects the police investigation, does it? These documents that the government has had to check with the police, they don't have any bearing on what the police is currently doing.
That's absolutely right, and that's quite deliberate because the government would not want to prejudice the police investigation. You'll remember that the police were looking at this strange offence called misconduct in public office, which is an offence developed by the judges over the years. As I think we've said a few times in the past, this refers to a public officer acting as such who willfully neglects to perform his duty or willfully misconducts himself to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. Now, there's no suggestion here that anything remotely approaching that criminal offence is disclosed by these documents. Obviously, there was this argument between Peter Mandelson and the government over how much he should be paid. What he said was, look, I was employed on a 4-year contract. The total that I would have got on this 4-year contract was just over £540,000. And since you're sacking me early, that's the amount I want. But obviously the government said, no, you're entitled to 3 months' notice and a small severance payment over that. And they were quite pleased that by negotiations with Peter Mandelson's lawyer, they were able to get him down to what they regarded as a perfectly reasonable settlement. Now, that's entirely normal commercial negotiating, absolutely nothing to do with any suggestion of a criminal offence.
Indeed, and of course, you know, anyone versed with HR will know that, you know, if severance is a part of the job, and indeed for civil service jobs especially, that there is a framework and a structure that they'll be working to, that they also have a duty of care to the person that they are letting go.
Yes, I think the most interesting aspect to me of all this paperwork that's been released is the amount of paperwork. One knows that the civil service obviously has to operate according to rules, but you somehow think that ambassadors don't have to fill in forms and sign this and, get a personal laptop and all that sort of thing. Well, it turns out they do. But you're absolutely right. These are systems and structures, and I don't think that the government can be faulted for settling his dismissal claim by effectively paying him the money he would have got if he'd got 3 months' notice to which he was entitled.
And in terms of what the police are investigating, a suspicion of misconduct in public office, which dates back to his time in the last Labour government, this suspicion that he may have leaked sensitive government information while serving as business secretary. How serious are these allegations? Legally, how bad could it potentially get for Mr Mandelson?
Because this is a common law offence developed by the judges, Parliament has never set a maximum sentence. What that means is the maximum penalty, if Mandelson was convicted of this misconduct in public office, is life imprisonment. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that's what he would get if he was found guilty by a jury on some future occasion, but it shows that the offence can be treated very seriously indeed. I think the only connection between what the police are investigating and what emerges from these documents is the fact that Peter Mandelson was meant to have been given developed vetting, DV, as it's referred to in the papers. And there's something called DV with strap, which is some sort of acronym, I think, or possibly a reference to these little phrases, secret, highly secret, top secret, very secret, that sort of thing that you get on the bottom of documents as a sort of strap line. It doesn't go into detail because these documents weren't meant to be revealed to people outside the civil service. But what I think we are talking about is the idea that officials should have looked into Peter Mandelson's past and discovered whether he was suitable to be appointed His Majesty's Ambassador to Washington. And obviously the question of whether that was dealt with properly and what that uncovered and what it should have uncovered is something of great interest to the police.
It's probably worth reiterating at this point, Joshua, that he denies any wrongdoing. He regrets his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. He has belatedly apologised to the victim. He also said throughout all of this that he was not motivated by financial gain. Joshua Rosenberg, legal commentator, always good to get your thoughts on such subjects. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, you're watching Sky News. The breaking news this afternoon is that a whole series of files have been released by the government surrounding the vetting and the employment and the severance deal for Peter Mandelson in his appointment as UK ambassador to the United States. He was given a payout of £75,000. Many questions about what was known about his past and what Keir Starmer himself personally knew. It's 4 o'clock. Our breaking news this hour. The first set of files relating to Peter Mandelson's appointment as the UK's ambassador to the United States have been released by the government. The files have revealed that the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was warned of a general reputational risk over appointing Lord Mandelson due to his relationship with the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. They've also revealed that the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor found that the appointment process was rushed. We've also learned that Lord Mandelson was given a severance payout of £75,000 following his sacking as ambassador, despite him asking for more than £500,000. Let's bring in our deputy political editor, Sam Coates. I'm sure we'll come to the money eventually, Sam. But tell us what you think are the most important things that have been revealed today.
What we've had today, Jay, is 147 pages of documentation released by the government that they never would have wanted to see out there, revealing exactly what Keir Starmer knew and what he didn't. This is what the document dump looks like, but let's take you straight to the most interesting release as part of that. This is the start of the two and a half page summary of the due diligence done on Peter Mandelson's appointment. There you can see the title at the top, and it goes through all sorts of potential risks, like his potential commercial conflicts of interest, the fact that the company that he was the president of didn't list its clients, and there could be problems with dealings with if that company dealt with the UK or USA government. It highlights how he twice had to resign as a Labour minister. But here, look at the second page. A large, big section on Jeffrey Epstein, the relationship with the most notorious paedophile, arguably, in the world. And in pitiless detail, Keir Starmer was warned, and we see it here. The most eye-popping bit of this document is where civil servants, and I'm going to just go in here, effectively, it says that the relationship continued across 2009 to 2011 with, between Lord Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, and continued after he stayed in the Labour government, reportedly staying at Epstein's house when he was in jail in 2009. This is what Keir Starmer saw before saying, yes, this should be our next ambassador to Washington. The relationship clearly continued because in 2014, Mandelson became a founding citizen of Epstein partner Ghislaine Maxwell's conservation group, Ocean Conservation Group. There was clearly a strong relationship between Mandelson and the paedophile, which continued after the paedophile had been jailed. Why did Keir Starmer do that? People in government say there's more documents to come, but it's clearly here in black and white, and in the words, the neutral words of the civil service here, you've got them saying, to note, general reputational risk. Keir Starmer cannot say he didn't know that Peter Mandelson kept up that relationship after Jeffrey Epstein's jailing. More things revealed. Peter Mandelson was suggesting that Nigel Farage might help the UK relationship with the Trump administration, which, as the civil servants point out, is contrary to UK government policy. And it was highlighted that Peter Mandelson had links to Russia and China, including being a non-executive director of a Russian company and stayed on the board until June 2017, long after the annexation of Crimea. So you get a sense of all of the things that were put before Keir Starmer and what he knew at the point at which he went through that. Now, I want to show you a couple of detailed notes about conversations with top aides at the time to Keir Starmer about the appointment. Here is a conversation between Keir Starmer's lawyer and then Director of Communications, Matthew Doyle. He basically said, look, I'm a personal friend of Lord Mandelson. I had meetings about this. I had personal one-on-one meetings with Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney about it. Some of those meetings were more formal than others. And it said that there was back and forth about Jeffrey Epstein with Morgan McSweeney and about Global Counsel. So he admits that they discussed potential problems but went ahead. But he did say another member of the top Starmer gang had reservations. Jonathan Powell, Keir Starmer's chief foreign affairs advisor, political advisor, was particularly cautious about that appointment. So let's look at what happened when Jonathan Powell spoke to Keir Starmer's lawyer after Peter Mandelson was sacked. And there it clearly makes absolutely plain that the appointment of Peter Mandelson, not only were there the warnings in black and white in the due diligence, but the most senior foreign affairs advisor around Keir Starmer was also incredibly cautious and nervous about it. So look at this. You see on the third bullet point down here, Jonathan Powell raised concerns about the individual and reputation to Morgan McSweeney. Very clear that he was worried about it. It says that Jonathan Powell doesn't recall any specific meetings that he was involved in. Really? We've just heard from Matthew Doyle that he was in loads of meetings about the Mandelson appointment, but the chief foreign affairs advisor wasn't. That is remarkable. And he said that the appointment process was unusual. And in the words of Jonathan Powell, it was weirdly rushed. So you can see the problems that that caused. Now, we've got a lot of detail from inside the room after Peter Mandelson was sacked. Keir Starmer came in, decided to terminate his contract, claimed that he'd been made aware of more than he knew at the time. But then there was the question of the payout. Look at this. This is not something Downing Street. Darren Jones saying today they wouldn't have wanted to pay a penny to Lord Mandelson, but he did get just shy of £75,000. You can see there on the screen, 40,000 for 3 months' notice and a termination payment for 34,000 because there wasn't a breach of contract. Peter Mandelson's friends going around saying that the due diligence was pretty weak, pretty quick. But it all got very tricky. There was, it seems, an attempt by Peter Mandelson to try and get them to pay his entire contract as ambassador over £500,000. And they thought they'd actually got quite a good deal by getting it down to just below £75,000. But all of this taking its toll. Peter Mandelson making clear that he wanted to be treated with respect as he left, saying he delayed his departure from the US after his sacking because of his dog. And then as all of this in February, so barely a month ago, when it emerged that all of these documents, all of these emails were going to be released from today, there were officials going, because of this, we need there to be a welfare check and to do it once a day, each day, if that's OK, for a while. Such is the concern just 4 weeks ago, the top of government, about the welfare of Peter Mandelson. Officials were doing daily welfare checks. All of this deeply embarrassing for Keir Starmer. The question, Jane, I think, is whether or not Keir Starmer was guilty of not pushing hard enough on the potential problems here, why he overrode the objections, if they were objections, or certainly the caution of Jonathan Powell, and whether or not he shouldn't have just dug harder into some of the things that were clear red flags in that 2-page due diligence document that make it absolutely plain that there are, very least, problems that needed to be investigated.
Thanks very much. In the last few minutes, Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, has been asked her reaction both to the latest situation in Iran, but also what we've learned today about Peter Mandelson's appointment.
What are you making of this?
So for so long, the Prime Minister has tried to make this about Peter Mandelson's lies. What this shows is that it is Keir Starmer himself who has lied repeatedly since the very start to the whole country about what he knew, when and how. And these files have exposed the fact that the Prime Minister has not been honest with the country or with the Commons about the extent to which he knew about this relationship.
One of the things that we've seen here is that Mandelson asked for more than £500,000 as a payoff after his sacking. He received 75,000, much less, but still that much taxpayer money. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that this is yet another indictment of Keir Starmer's judgment. He wants to make this all about Peter Mandelson asking for money. The fact is, he wouldn't have been paying out that severance package if he hadn't appointed him in the first place. And the vetting that we have now seen, the documents that we have now seen, have shown that the Prime Minister should never have made this decision. He has not been honest with the country. He's not been honest with Parliament about what he knew. Now he's complaining about the severance package, but the fact is he's the one who signed it off in the first place.
And so what are you saying about Keir Starmer? What should he do now?
Well, I think that Keir Starmer is a man who is in office but not in power. He is held hostage by his backbenchers, and they can see right now that as much as the Prime Minister wanted to make this about Peter Mandelson, this is really about Keir Starmer being dishonest with them, with the country, with Parliament about what he knew. There are not enough Conservative MPs to remove the Prime Minister. He won a landslide. I think Labour MPs now need to consider their conscience and their position and ask if this man is fit to run our country.
So is this a resigning matter?
Well, I think that it is, but we can't make him resign.
But presumably your message to him is you need to resign.
The only people who can fix this are Labour backbenchers. They can see that Keir Starmer has lied repeatedly about what he knew and when. He's tried to make this all about Peter Mandelson. This is about his judgment, and they should consider whether this is someone who is fit to run our country. He did it again at PMQs today. He says things that are simply not true to try to get himself out of a hole. All of this mess is of his own making.
On kind of what you're saying are lies at PMQ today, can I just ask you, you're questioned a lot about your position on Iran, accused of a U-turn. Can you clear it up? Did you ever say that we should be involved in offensive action in this conflict?
My position has been very clear. The fact is, we were not part of this war. I did think that we should have allowed the US to use our bases sooner. In the end, the Prime Minister U-turned and did that. I did say that if people are striking at British bases, then we should launch offensive action. I used the phrase, it's not enough to catch the arrows, we should stop the archer.
Offensive action is getting involved in the war, though.
Well, but the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, has actually agreed with me. He said the same thing on BBC on Friday. What the Prime Minister is doing is muddling up loads of things which he perfectly understands, and hoping that he can confuse the country. It is yet another example, like with the Mandelson case, of telling people things that he knows are not true to get himself out of a hole. He was asked 6 questions on fuel duty. He did not want to talk about fuel duty, something that he can control. He should not be increasing fuel duty. Instead, he decided to go on about the war in a bit of whataboutery. This is a man who will lie to get himself out of a difficult position. I think that that is appalling. I think that he should be considering his position. And what the release of the Mandelson files has shown is that this is not just about Peter Mandelson. This is about the Prime Minister, whose judgment is so terrible. He appointed the best friend of a convicted paedophile to a job knowing the full extent of their relationship. He should consider his position.
OK, I mean, this is a really, hopefully, an easy answer, but do you think he should be resigning then?
Well, I've said this already multiple times on what he's doing to the economy, on what he's been doing to our veterans, on what he's done on the Mandelson case, just not being able to run the country. He is in office and not in power.
It's a yes, all
I can do is tell Labour MPs who have the power, do you think that this man is fit to run our country? I don't think so. We should have an honest Prime Minister.
Well, Kemi Badenoch there saying that the Prime Minister should consider his position. John Craig is with me, so she's stopping short of saying he should resign, but she's dancing on the head of a pin, isn't she?
That's political code for saying someone should quit when they say consider the position. That was powerful stuff from Kemi Badenoch. Lied, lied, lied. She said it several times. Now, the Speaker, you probably heard, the Prime Minister's questions today got pretty cross with a Tory MP who shouted from the front bench that the Prime Minister was a liar. You can't say that in the Commons because that's unparliamentary. You can't get away with that. But she obviously... The Tories are very miffed.
You can't say it in the lobby, though.
Yes, in an interview, yeah. The Tories are very miffed. We heard this from Alex Burghardt, that the government chose to release all this material after Prime Minister's questions, therefore denying Kemi Badenoch and other MPs the chance to quiz Sir Keir Starmer. Now, she is right in what she says, in that many, many times she did quiz the Prime Minister at PMQs. Now, I think it was 5 weeks ago today, February the 4th, that the Commons voted on the nod, as it turned out, to release all this information, the so-called humble address in the jargon. And I made a note of it at the time. Can the Prime Minister tell us, did the official security vetting that he, the Prime Minister, received, mention Mandelson's ongoing relationship with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein? And at that point, the Prime Minister said, yes, it did. And then she said, what the Prime Minister has just said is just shocking, because up to that, he wasn't answering that question. So she is clearly referring today to the numerous occasions when the Prime Minister did not admit that he was told about all the risks and so on. Now, the documents that have been published today absolutely lay bare the fact that the Prime Minister knew everything about Mandelson and went ahead and appointed him. And so the Leader of the Opposition now is really going in for the kill, almost, really. Certainly to wound, if not to kill, saying he should consider his position. He's lied and he's lied. So the Prime Minister is, as we might have expected, given all these documents that have been published today, the Prime Minister is really back under enormous pressure from the opposition parties over the Mandelson affair. And we saw in the House of Commons this afternoon, MPs just sort of almost with their heads in their hands just couldn't believe that, given the weight of evidence we've seen today, that he went ahead with this appointment. Well,
let's just remind you what the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, gave the Commons in his statement this afternoon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has taken responsibility for Peter Mandelson's appointment as Ambassador to the United States. He has acknowledged it was a mistake and has apologised, not least for believing Peter Mandelson's lies. Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country. And I reiterate for the House that the Prime Minister deeply regrets taking him at his word. It was a mistake to do so. I'm sure that Right Honourable and Honourable members across the House will also read in these documents with interest how Peter Mandelson conducted himself after his withdrawal as ambassador. As the documents show, regarding his severance payment, Peter Mandelson initially requested a sum that was substantially larger than the final payment. Not just 2 or even 3 times, but more than 6 times the final amount.
Well, Alex Burkhardt delivered the response on behalf of the Conservatives.
It's very clear that those victims were not in the Prime Minister's mind when he appointed Peter Mandelson. The Prime Minister has already admitted that he knew Mandelson had maintained his friendship with Epstein even after the latter's conviction for his terrible crimes. That was a bad choice, and it's a choice that we can now read about in black and white, Madam Deputy Speaker, on page 11, where the Prime Minister was told after Epstein was first convicted of procuring an underage girl in 2008, their relationship continued across 2009 to 2011, beginning when Lord Mandelson was business minister and continuing after the end of the Labour government. Mandelson reportedly stayed in Epstein's house while he was in jail in 2009. Now, the Prime Minister claims that he was lied to. He wasn't lied to by this due diligence document. And it may be that Mandelson denied these claims. And if so, maybe the Prime Minister was lied to. But he was lied to by an inveterate liar who had been fired twice before. And we're supposed to believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Prime Minister, who was once the chief prosecutor in this country, couldn't see through this nonsense. It beggars belief.
Well, let's return to John to get his reaction to how the different parties are reacting to this.
Well, the Conservatives there, Alex Burghardt was making the point that the Prime Minister has said time and time again at Prime Minister's questions that he was lied to by Peter Mandelson. And then, as you heard, he made the point there that, hold on, this is the guy who used to be the Director of Public Prosecutions. Lots of MPs in the exchanges this afternoon made that claim as well, that it beggars belief, as Alex Burghardt said, that the Prime Minister believed what Peter Mandelson had told him. What we saw from Darren Jones in the House of Commons today was a very determined attempt at damage limitation. I'm not sure if it succeeded. You heard the sort of provincial bank manager style of Darren Jones there, trying to damp down the row, trying to calm things down. He repeatedly said in answer to questions from MPs that the Prime Minister regrets making the appointment. Now, you also heard him, Mr Jones, talk about the severance payment. There were gasps and cries from MPs when he revealed that Mr Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, demanded £500,000 in severance. And there was anger about the fact that he's getting any payoff at all, £70,000 odd. Mr Jones, Ed Davey, lots of others said he shouldn't get a penny. Now, we heard from the backbenches as well some pretty stinging criticism of the whole process. First of all, let's hear from Richard Bergen, Labour left-winger, one of the rebels last night in the Commons vote on juries. This was Richard Bergen's attack on both the decision and indeed the whole system as he saw it.
And I hold in my hand the advice that was given to the Prime Minister before he made the decision to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the USA. Reading this advice document, it's clear that the Prime Minister wouldn't have given the go-ahead for this individual, Peter Mandelson, to stand as a Labour candidate for Town Council, but instead he was elevated, despite what's in the document, despite what was known, to this most important of positions. There's a whole section entitled Relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. The question that has to be asked is, how did it even get to the stage where the Prime Minister was interviewing Mandelson for this job and considering him for this job? The simple answer is political. It's because it suited the interests of a tiny faction in the Labour Party, funded by big business, who wanted Mandelson at the heart of things in order to shift a Labour government away from the agenda that a real Labour government should have. That's why Mandelson was popular with these people. That's why he was one of their favoured sons. And that's why, despite his despicable character, despite his greed and his avarice, he was put in this position despite what was known. Isn't that the case?
It's not for me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to speak on behalf of Peter Mandelson, but evidently he put himself forward for this role, which is how he ended up in the process in the first place. To the question of his appointment, as I've said to the House, the Prime Minister regrets his appointment and apologises for it, and had he known what the House now knows, he would never have appointed him in the first place.
So a critique there from the Labour left, from Richard Bergen, and that was one of the many occasions when Darren Jones said in response to MPs, Prime Minister apologises, wish he hadn't made the appointment. But there was criticism really from all sides of the House. There was also mentions of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and of course because there's been a call from Parliament for documents about him to be provided, and it was Ed Davey who raised that and said let's have those soon. But anyway, from the Conservative side, we heard among others from Sir Julian Lewis. Now he is the former chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, which has played a role in this whole process between February the 4th, when the Commons voted to produce these documents, and now 5 weeks. That committee, high-powered committee, has been vetting the information to weed out some of the stuff that, in the words of the government motion, or rather the motion that was passed, national security and international relations stuff taken out, stripped out. We may hear some of those at some point. But this was Julian Lewis not being terribly nice about Peter Mandelson.
Disobliging.
Disobliging.
The Chief Secretary deserves our admiration for always being calm and courteous, even in the most trying circumstances, but he really mustn't take us for fools.
Oh, yes.
Peter Mandelson had a reputation as one of the most slippery and sleazy characters in modern British politics. The Chief Secretary confirms that the Prime Minister was warned about what Mandelson had done in continuing a relationship with Epstein after he had been sent to jail for abusing a young girl. He is saying that, well, the Prime Minister didn't know the depth of this relationship. Is he really expecting us to believe that a shallow relationship with a convicted paedophile is okay?
I would just say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that at the time of the appointment, there were public comments from Peter Mandelson, I think in a Financial Times interview, where he had said that his relationship had ended much earlier than documents now show was to be the case. On the back of the Cabinet Office reports about those newspaper stories, the Prime Minister had further questions put to Peter Mandelson, documents for which we will be able to publish in due course, and that's why the Prime Minister says that he regrets having believed Peter Mandelson's lies and wished he'd never appointed him in the first place.
So there you heard Darren Jones again repeating that the regret of the Prime Minister. Slippery and sleazy were the words that Julian Lewis used. He's not normally an MP for great colourful phrases or hyperbole, Julian Lewis, but he really let rip there. And, of course, we kept lots of insults hurled at Epstein, as you might expect, words like despicable and so on. But really, I mean, what we've learned this afternoon is that the Prime Minister is in deep trouble once again, plunged right into trouble. The Leader of the Opposition is saying he should consider his position. She's claiming he's lied to Parliament. And also, one of the other points that was made by Alex Burghardt and others is that the Prime Minister, instead of scuttling out of Prime Minister's questions like he normally does at 12:30 on a Wednesday, should have been there to answer questions himself, rather than sending Darren Jones, his little helper, his fixer, to face the music. He did it very skillfully, as he always does, trying to sort of calm things down. But there will no doubt be attempts to drag the Prime Minister to the House of Commons over the next few days. He will try and avoid that and wait till next Wednesday's PMQs, no doubt. But the Prime Minister really is going to be facing some even more tough questions now about what he knew, and the allegation from Kemi Badenoch that he lied in interviews and also in the House of Commons.
John, thanks very much. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Anne McElvoy, executive editor at Politico and co-host, of course, of Politics at Sam and Anne's, about the criticism that the Prime Minister could face after today's statement.
I think there's another mystery here, and it's not one that is very flattering, I'm afraid, to the Prime Minister, which is there was clearly a lot of to and fro. We're probably getting a bit more granular detail as Sam was taking us through there, that at any point the Prime Minister could have just been more proactive and said, if this man is supposed to be so important to my operations, to my relationship with Donald Trump, to getting the UK's business done, I should maybe spend a bit more time with him and work through some of this stuff. That is that sense that you often hear as a criticism of the Prime Minister, that he floats above too much. He lets officials, he lets allies, he lets other people get on with things on his behalf. And then when they go wrong, he said, well, I didn't know about that. You know, I thought this was all going to be fine. So I think that will be a criticism that will be a reasonable one that will be made even by people who are not, like, you know, are always out to get the Prime Minister. The other question, and you refer to it, is that why did he feel that Peter Mandelson there was so important? Now, could it be that this relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and what that signified, of course, we now know worse and worse and worse, but we knew quite a lot at the time about his conviction and how terrible and tawdry and shocking that was, that it was a bit like factored in. This is this character. He knows everyone. He knows light and shade. The Trump administration would be kind of disappointed if he didn't know people who were as famous or even infamous as Jeffrey Epstein. You know, I think that is a kind of glaze of cynicism over this. It is not to say that Keir Starmer, I'm sure, is a perfectly upstanding man when it comes to his morality and what he would think about this terrible saga of abuse of women and girls. He wouldn't say that doesn't matter, but for some reason, it fell down the order of priorities for him. It didn't seem to stop him, and it certainly didn't even give him, as it would appear at the moment. I mean, they say, of course, we'll know more when we hear where the police get to in their investigation. But somehow he did not stop and think, hang on, is this really worth doing? You know, are there more than reputational risks? Is this just something in all conscience that we shouldn't be alongside?
And McElvoy there, well, she's usually down the line with Sam, who's here in the studio with me on their morning podcast. So, Sam, we're about to lose you, desperately, sadly, from this half-hour broadcasting. Not entirely. What, as you leave us, are your big reflections on the big picture that we've seen revealed today?
So we've got the first 147 pages. We're going to get maybe tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 of different stuff in total. But for me, Jane, the biggest thing is not only seeing the allegations of what was put before the Prime Minister in black and white, but there's one new fact that for me trumps all others. And I'm going to take you to this one document and take you through it. And that was that in order to get this appointment over the line, Keir Starmer had to basically ignore the concerns of his own Foreign Affairs advisor, Jonathan Powell, who goes back years in the heart of Labour projects. And he said, Jonathan Powell, in a meeting with Keir Starmer's lawyer after the sacking, that he raised concerns about Peter Mandelson and the reputation of Peter Mandelson to Morgan McSweeney. Morgan McSweeney responded that the issues had been addressed. Jonathan Powell, I think, a 3-decade veteran of the Labour Party, raising those concerns and just being told they've been addressed. He went on to say that he wasn't involved in the meetings, even though he was the chief Foreign Affairs advisor, and he found the appointment process of appointing Lord Mandelson unusual and weirdly rushed. And I think all of that, Jane, speaks to this idea that Keir Starmer only heard what he wanted to hear in some senses. And you do have this feeling that some aides were very keen, others, well, their advice just wasn't taken perhaps as loudly and as prominently as they should be. That is the biggest new fact as far as I'm concerned today. But reading all of it spelt out pitilessly how Keir Starmer was told in black and white that Jeffrey Epstein offered Peter Mandelson hospitality while he was in jail. Peter Mandelson solicited that. What happened after that? It's clearly some things we don't know, but those are the questions that I think the Prime Minister is going to find the hardest to answer after today.
OK, Sam, thanks very much, and thanks for bringing us that all with a lot of clarity over this afternoon. It's been really fascinating drilling down into the details of that. Thank you. Well, as if by magic, while Sam was going through all that, as well as John Craig being here, we're also joined by Labour Party political advisor John McTernan. John, really good to get your thoughts today. A former colleague of Peter Mandelson. During his time with Blair, you'll have worked very closely with him. What are your feelings today about this?
I couldn't believe it when I saw how thin the report from the Propriety and Ethics team was. It was, you know, links to articles, hyperlinks to articles and references to documents. They should have laid out fully all the issues that the Prime Minister had to consider. Propriety and ethics aren't meant to judge on an appointment, but they're meant to say, these are genuine risks and these are the actual facts. And if you want to ask questions, ask these questions. And the fact of staying overnight in the townhouse of a man convicted of trafficking children for prostitution, while the man was actually serving a sentence, should have ruled you out from public office ever again. But
the fact is, those facts were contained in this document, and those documents were read. But it was a short document; they were in there. Why did Keir Starmer ignore them?
It was not as if I had been providing that, I would have said that you need to have more.
We've looked at them today; they're in black and white.
Yeah, you need it was a charge sheet. I'll tell you what. Looking at that document, looking at the process, it looks as though a group of men met in private and decided to push through an appointment with disregard for the girls and the young women who've had no justice properly in America. That's what it looked like to me. It's patriarchal attitudes in private, in Number 10, to secure the appointment of a particular man. Nothing to do. The procedures were all ignored.
The fact is, though, that what was known about Epstein, what was in the public knowledge, was spelt out in black and white for Keir Starmer. We saw that Jonathan Powell clearly had concerns about it. Yep. So it had registered on his radar. Why do you think it didn't register on Keir Starmer's?
It looks as though, and we're missing all kinds of things from this documentation, aren't we? We're missing any of the WhatsApp messages from Peter to Morgan, from Morgan to the Prime Minister. There's a whole set of communications totally missing. This is just minutes. This is not all the conversations that are being held. And it looks like a decision was made for a long time out, as they cited in some of the papers. Oh yeah, there's been a bit of coverage about Peter, in the press about maybe being the next ambassador. There was a campaign externally and a campaign internally, and this was a campaign being delivered. I mean, it was a campaign mentality, wasn't it? There was no thing about. no due diligence, just, I think, dire negligence.
John, we're going to get you to stay because we've also been joined by a political commentator and, of course, our former political editor, my old colleague Adam Moulton. He joins us as well. Adam, you were somebody who considered Peter Mandelson a friend also. Why do you think what was publicly known clearly and what we've seen in these documents was overlooked, you could say, or ignored by Keir Starmer?
Well, first of all, what was publicly known was not what we got out of the Epstein files. You know, the details about Peter Mandelson going on holiday, even the sucking up birthday card, the taking of money allegedly both by him and by Ronaldo da Silva, his husband. And certainly no one knew about the passing of government information when he was a minister. So when the decision was taken, it was on what was on the public file. And, you know, I've got this document here. And it says there are two areas, actually. One is the fact that he had to resign from government twice before. And the summary is to say, to note general reputational risk around previous departures from new Labour government, both relating to financial matters, including high-profile donors to the government. And then the whole Epstein section, a few hundred words, it says at the end, general reputational risk. Now, I don't think it was any secret that it was a gamble to appoint Peter Mandelson. There were people who thought because of his political and skills he was worth appointing. On the basis of what I knew, I have to say I agreed with that. I think with hindsight, people view it differently. But the truth is, this is just a stage in the process of finding out things, as John McTinnon was saying. And as far as the Prime Minister's position today, it's a nothing burger. It doesn't actually make it any worse for Keir Starmer than it was before. And basically, you know, one would have to say that the leader of the opposition has almost certainly gone, not for the first time, pretty dramatically over the top, because her basic attack is really rebuffed by the government claiming that Peter Mandelson lied about his relationship with Epstein. And there's nothing in this to suggest that he did. That's because we don't have the key documents, as John was saying. So there's no evidence. So even though we had Darren Jones today talking about, you know, saying his disgust and horror at Peter Mandelson's friendship with Epstein and that his behaviour was an insult and he should never have been appointed, that is all with hindsight. I think the only bad news, as Sam Coates was just saying to you, for the Prime Minister, is this memo about Jonathan Powell. Because, you know, Jonathan Powell is questioned when the balloon went up, when the first lot of documents came out in September, about his role in the process. He, first of all, says, as National Security Advisor, he wasn't particularly involved. Then he says he found the appointment process unusual. And remember, Jonathan Powell's not just a National Security Advisor, he was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff for 10 years.
And a senior diplomat in Washington before that.
Yeah, and he criticises the man now doing the job, or then doing the job that he had, Morgan McSweeney, saying that he raised concerns about the individual and his reputation with Morgan McSweeney. And he goes further and he says that Philip Barton, now Sir Philip Barton, who was the head of the Foreign Office at the time, shared his reservations around the appointment. Now, all that simply says that the political buck for the appointment ultimately will stop with the Prime Minister and quite possibly David Lammy, who's also mentioned in these documents as being important. But that is all, you know, to come. We don't have today those killer blows against the...
But it does make it clear that, one, the Prime Minister had been told in black and white that Peter Mandelson had stayed at Jeffrey Epstein's flat when he was in prison.
Yeah.
You know, so we know that, and we also know now that there were people within the organisation, Jonathan Powell, raising flags to the Prime Minister. So it does really raise questions.
I mean, we also,
it was up to the Prime Minister to make the call.
Well, we know what
it?
happened, but we also have, going back to 2002, when Epstein had a brief audience with Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister. It's quite clear that it was Peter Mandelson was pushing him. But, you know, interestingly, the two reasons why he was saying that he should see this very wealthy American financier was that he was a friend of Bill Clinton, who'd just given up being president, and also then seen as a plus that he was a friend of Prince Andrew.
Okay.
Well, with hindsight, that's not a plus.
We're just going to quickly step away from that for 1 minute, sorry, Adam, because we're going to hear from President Trump, who's leaving the White House on the way to Kentucky. He's just been speaking to the cameras. Let's just let you know what happened a few moments ago.
Mr. President, day 11, and as you know, we're doing something that nobody ever thought was possible to do. Our military is the best. It's the most powerful in the world, and they're hitting them very hard. This is 47 years of abuse and killing lots of people, killing and maiming lots of people. What is it, Peter?
Mr. President, what more do you need to do militarily for this operation to end?
More of the same, and we'll see how that all comes out. Right now, they've lost their Navy, they've lost their Air Force, they have no anti-aircraft apparatus at all. They have no radar. Their leaders are gone. And we could do a lot worse to one another. We're leaving certain things that if we take them out, or we could take them out by this afternoon, in fact, within an hour, they literally would never be able to build that country back.
A new report shows, a new report says that the military investigation has found that the United States struck the school in Iran. As Commander-in-Chief, do you take responsibility for that?
That is what?
As Commander-in-Chief, do you...
For what?
For the strike on the school in Iran. A new report says the military investigation has found it was the United States that struck the school.
I don't know about that.
Are you talking to the CEOs of various oil companies, encouraging them to use the Strait of Hormuz right now?
They should. I think they should. I think they should use this. In my opinion, look, we took out just about all of their mine ships in one night. We're up to boat number 60. I didn't realize they had that big a Navy. I would say it was big and ineffective. But every one of their ships, just about all of their Navy is gone at the bottom of the sea.
Mr. President, how do you respond? Mr. President, have they laid any mines in the Strait of Hormuz?
We don't think so.
Mr. President, is Senator Thune listening to you when you say you want to pass the Save America Act? He says there aren't the votes to do it right now. What's your response?
Well, he's got to be a leader, you know? If he's a leader, he's got to get him. It's the most popular bill I've ever seen put before Congress. And it's voter ID, and it's voter. You have to be able to be a citizen to vote. It's called citizenship. And we're also adding in no men playing in women's sports, no transgender mutilization of our children, and no mail-in ballots, fake mail-in ballots. We have none of that, except in the case of the military, etc. I would say it is the Save America Act. It's the most popular bill I think I've ever put before Congress.
Mr. President, can you declare victory in this war if the supreme leader remains the Ayatollah's son?
I don't want to comment on that. I don't want to comment. But I will tell you, I just spoke with various countries, the leaders of various countries. You'll have a list. And they said they've never seen anything like it. We have, and I built it during my first term, and I used it. I didn't realize I was going to use it this much, but we have the greatest military in the world by far. Nobody close.
About a domestic terrorist attack by Iran, sir? No.
We're not invited to the Shield of the Americas. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia were not invited to the Shield of the Americas. Why was that? And could they come in the future to the event?
I think they were invited. Maybe they didn't come. I think they were. I get along very well with all of them.
In Iraqi parliament, student, member slogan, date to America, date to Israel. What is your response to them? What is your message for Iraqi government?
What did he say?
In Iraqi parliament, slogan, date of America, date of Israel, member of the parliament.
Death to America, death to Israel. What's your response?
That's not a nice question.
Mr. President, did Spain give in after you told them that you would commerce ties with them? Are they cooperating with the United States?
Who?
Spain.
No, they're not. I think they're not cooperating at all. Spain, I think they've been very bad. Very bad. Not good at all. We may cut off trade with Spain.
You guys all trade with them?
I don't know what Spain's doing. They've been very bad to NATO. They get protected. They don't want to pay their fair share. And they've been that way for many years, actually. Let me give you the good news. Let me give you the good news. The people of Spain are fantastic. The leadership, like you. The leadership, not so good.
Lebanon is under attack, and Hezbollah is making dangers for the Lebanese, and especially the Lebanese Christians. What is your message for Lebanon?
Well, we're working on it very hard. We love Lebanon. We love the people of Lebanon, and we're working very hard. We got to get rid of the Hezbollah. Has been a disaster for many years.
Well, that there, President Trump, just speaking as he gets onto Air Force One, Marine One, he says, talking about Iran, that they've lost, all of their ships are gone, they have no aircraft, no radar. Within an hour, they literally will never be able to build their country back. We will get more reaction from what's happening in Iran in the news at 5 o'clock. But for now, we're going to return to what's happened in the House of Commons today, the release of the information about Peter Mandelson and his appointment and severance. We've got John Craig, we've got John McTernan, former Labour advisor, and also political commentator Adam Bolton next to me. John Craig, you wanted to come in. I asked Adam a little bit earlier, you know, why
did they do it?
Why did they do it when they knew what his friendship with Epstein? It's clear they knew it, and it's clear they did it anyway.
I tell you who let the cat out of the bag last year in an interview here on Sky News. It was Peter Kyle talking to Trevor Phillips one Sunday morning, and he said that the government had decided he was worth the risk. It was a risk worth taking, and what a dreadful risk it turned out to be.
Yeah. John, you know, the risk because they thought presumably he was a bit of a Trump whisperer. They thought that he would be somebody positive on the other side of the pond, somebody who understood it. We saw from these documents today that Mandelson was suggesting that Farage would be a good person to bring into the fold about this. He clearly had an in with Trump.
Yeah, no, look, you saw just in that clip with the live pool with President Trump, he's theatrical. He's a performer. And that is also true of Peter as a politician. Peter was a matching character. And I think the decision was made on that basis. Someone as theatrical and at times as scheming as Peter may well be the right person to match up with him. But I go back to that. The heart of this is men in private making a decision in which the consideration is how women were treated. And it's the ability of patriarchal politics to ignore the thing that's there, that no woman involved in that decision would have allowed that to pass. You could stay in a convicted sex offender's house, a convicted sex offender who trafficked children for prostitution. That's the thing about it that's at the heart of this, and the reason why it's a big story is it's brutal and scandalous, but we're looking into a world where men together in private can overlook that because they think it might make a headline, it might make a splash, it might be interesting. Over in the West Midlands, we've actually got an export quota of 100,000 cars, which matches the number of cars that we actually sell from the UK. So in the technical detail that Peter Carr would say it was a risk worth taking, I think he was right. There's car workers who've got their jobs secured by this. But at what cost? It costs the reputation of the government, costs the reputation of all politics, I think, because it shows it's a horrible light to have politics seen.
But I think there is still an evolution going on the issues you raise about the treatment of women and girls, and the extent to which it should impinge on all politics. And there's a big waking up process if you go in government coming out of this. I mean, at the time that the appointment was made, as John says, the reason why he was appointed was because he had been Trade Secretary twice, he had been the EU trade negotiator, trade and tariffs was very much on the agenda, plus he was familiar with Trump and Trump's style of operating. And, you know, as ambassador, he did get himself into the Oval Office and get Trump saying that he was a very handsome man, and although Trump now says he can't remember.
Lovely accent, he said.
Diplomatic. So you know, he was a good operator in that sense, but he did have, you know, all this baggage, which at the time they thought it was a risk worth taking. And had we not had the Epstein files being released by the Department of Justice, he would still be there. I mean, let's remember that, in spite of, you know, his friendship with Epstein.
And it's interesting, you said that Darren Jones, at the very end of his initial statement to the House today, said, and I wrote it down, we must learn hard lessons about a culture that dismisses women's concerns too easily and swiftly. And you do get the sense that perhaps there is a realisation in government of where they failed here.
Yeah, and of course, it overlaps into the trans issue, it overlaps into the issue about changing the legal system and jury trials and all that. I mean, all these things are very live. There's still a reckoning going on.
And you've got women joint chiefs of staff, which is a good move in number 10.
John, how much damage do you think this is still causing to the Labour Party, and how much more damage could it cause to the Labour Party? Because we've still got a lot more to come out.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the damage has been done. The damage was done when the appointment was made. It's just like, you know, the damage of Denton Gorton, the damage was done when, selfishly, the Labour Party NEC blocked Andy Burnham. The damage is baked in to this government at the moment, and they've got to get to the end of this to try to get some clear air to do something else. But unless they can do something big on housing, something big on the big issues facing the country, we'll keep coming back to this, which is, you know, they're good at process and they're bad at process, and this is the mother of all process.
And this is not going to go away.
No.
Because we've got the police investigation, then we've got more documents to come out, whatever the police decide, plus we've got whatever emerges in America. So, and, you know, what happens to Prince Andrew? I mean, this is just a nightmare. And the problem is that by appointing Peter Mandelson, Keir Starmer has basically identified himself with this issue, which is not...
He's nationalised the problem.
Not a comfortable position to be in.
How much, I wanted to, Adam, do you think that, you know, John was talking about Peter Mandelson being like Trump, being flamboyant. Now, these are things you wouldn't necessarily lay at the door of Keir Starmer. I wonder how much of the appointment was to do with Keir Starmer thinking that this was a man who has skills that he doesn't have, not just a Trump whisperer. It's somebody bringing something additional.
No, I think that's
a bit of stardust.
I think that is very, very accurate. That you know, everyone was mocking him for being cautious, for not making up his mind, and so he thought he would make a big, bold move, which it's pretty clear he was encouraged with by Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff. And, you know, it has just blown up in his face, you know, absolutely horribly. But I have to say that in the end, although the damage is going to be on the Prime Minister, you have to blame Peter Mandelson. I mean, there was no doubt that Peter Mandelson sought this appointment.
Yeah.
And knowing what only he knew at that stage about his relationship with Epstein, he should never have done it. And you know, the tragedy of Peter Mandelson is going to be that here is a man genuinely dedicated to reforming the Labour Party as he sees it, the whole project. And he single-handedly now has discredited it. You know, that's why Morgan McSweeney's out of the government.
He's a man able to give good advice, strategic advice, to anybody other than himself.
Yes, that's been said before. That was said, I remember, when the two occasions he had to resign from the cabinet.
If he'd asked somebody...
I just on the question of the Mandelson flamboyance, if you like. I remember at the time when Keir Starmer was in the Oval Office, and that stunt of pulling the envelope out of his jacket and the invitation from the King to... I remember at the time thinking, actually, that's a really clever stunt. And I thought at the time, classic Mandelson. I'm assuming it was. Well, I wonder if there's those who are now saying perhaps the royals shouldn't go to America in a month's time. I don't know, that's a different story.
We also learnt today, Adam, that daily welfare checks were being carried out on Lord Mandelson after he left office. What's been your conversations with him recently? When did you last speak to him?
I spoke to him in January, and I haven't spoken to him since. But yeah, I mean, look, this is such a calamitous ruin which could end up in prison. That obviously people have to be concerned about. I mean, you know, Prince Andrew had his guns taken away. You know, people clearly have to be concerned about this. My feeling in this, though, and you know, what I've heard about Peter Mandelson is that he still doesn't get it. He still does not realise how offensive, really, his behaviour has been. His lawyers, Misconduct, are saying, well, you didn't break the law, you're going to be all right in the long run. But the final revelation, and you may say, John may say, well, this reflects the patriarchy and all the rest. The final revelation about the treachery, about the passing of documents, you know, the remaining people who were sticking by Peter Mandelson at that stage just decided they couldn't because they hadn't been forewarned or told about it, and there wasn't, you know, they thought there was nothing worse to come. And then, in political terms, not talking about human terms, but in political terms, I mean, that is, you know, absolutely unbelievable, you know, passing
It's just basic stuff, isn't it? You're not passing
and
it on to anybody.
There's something, again, which it's ironic about this whole thing, tragically ironic, that Peter was an expert in branding and rebranding. He rebranded the Labour Party. And the core in political branding is really simple in the UK. If you are a Conservative politician, you're brought down by a sex scandal because you actually are a party of individual morality. And if you're a Labour politician, you're brought down by greed because the Labour Party is meant to be the party of equality. And there's a rapaciousness and a greed at the heart of this, seeking not just to be with rich people, to enrich oneself.
And we
but indirectly, it also has a sex angle as well.
Question, didn't we?
Demanding $500,000.
The demand of $500,000.
No, I think that, you know, about half this document actually is kind of HR letters.
This is HR letters.
You know, the fact that even at that stage, having, you know, been sacked by Ollie Robbins in a sort of late night phone call, he then thought that there was grounds for coming back for $500,000, you know, is quite extraordinary. I mean, the other sort of less reported aspect of Peter Mandelson's fall is that there are a lot of other people who've been financially ruined by Peter Mandelson as a result of association with him.
Adam, we're going to have to leave it there. John, we're going to have to leave it there. We're off air in 10 seconds. John McTernan, John Craig, Adam Bolton, thank you all very much. The News Hour's coming up next with Mark. Stay with us.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Mark Austin. This is the News Hour. The top stories. He was warned. Documents show the Prime Minister knew Peter Mandelson's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein posed a reputational risk. Also revealed the disgraced peer asked for a £500,000 payoff when he was sacked as US ambassador. In the Middle East, more cargo ships attacked as Iran vows not to let a single drop of oil through a key waterway. As Iran confirms it will boycott the World Cup and brands the US government corrupt. And pupils in lockdown as a schoolgirl is stabbed and a schoolboy arrested in Norwich. Good evening, and the first batch of government files about the decision to hire Lord Mandelson has been released, and it doesn't make happy reading for the Prime Minister. The documents clearly show that Sir Keir Starmer was warned that Mandelson was so close to Jeffrey Epstein that he had stayed in the paedophile's house while Epstein was in prison. And the files show that Mandelson asked for more than £500,000 severance pay when he was fired as ambassador. First tonight, with the detail in the documents, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Sam.
Mark, 147 pages. That is what the government have disclosed today. It's pretty damning stuff for Keir Starmer, and it puts in black and white some of the things that we can see that he was told before Keir Starmer's appointment. Let's take you through some of the key bits. We are given for the first time the 2-page due diligence checklist, and we can see that on the screen right now. But it's only the second page for when we get to the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. You can see it up there. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And there it cites the 10-year relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Lord Mandelson and concludes here. The business Mandelson was reportedly staying at Epstein House while he was in jail in June 2009. So there we have evidence. The Prime Minister was shown before the appointment of Peter Mandelson to Washington that he stayed in the home of a convicted paedophile at the point he was in jail. Why was this not a big enough red flag to prevent the appointment will be a big question in the coming days. There are so many other red flags, potentially red flags, not least what were the connections with Russia that the report flags. And here has he suggested using Nigel Farage, Mandelson suggesting Nigel Farage would make a better, they could use better his UK connections to the Trump administration. Another big revelation that I was surprised about, bluntly, from today's files, and that's this. It's about a figure, big figure, for 30 years in Labour politics, Jonathan Powell. Right now, he is Keir Starmer's most senior political foreign affairs advisor. He's been at the heart of Labour politics, Blair's chief of staff. And here, look at this. Jonathan Powell says he raised concerns about Peter Mandelson and his reputation to the Prime Minister's then chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney. Morgan McSweeney responded that the issues had been addressed. And it appears, you can see that, JP doesn't recall any specific meetings on this that he was involved in. It looks like Jonathan Powell was basically cut out of the process. Look at that top bullet point. Jonathan Powell found the appointment process unusual and weirdly rushed. How could this veteran, who was in charge of political foreign affairs, not have his concerns taken more seriously by the Prime Minister? That, another big question about what's going on. Now, look at this. This is about the severance payment, the sum paid in after September 2025 sacking of Lord Mandelson. And here we have the exact sums, just shy of £75,000. That's what Peter Mandelson got. You can see it on the screen there. But what's this? If you look at what Lord Mandelson was asking for, here it's revealed in some of the HR correspondence, he wanted over £500,000 for the whole life of the contract, the civil service said now. Now, about a month ago, all these documents were going to be released. But such was the concern inside government about the state of Lord Mandelson's mind at this point. Look at this. Senior officials were saying that there needed to be a welfare check every day on Lord Mandelson because of these documents that have been released today. Toll on Peter Mandelson, but quite frankly, the issue here is the way the government have treated Lord Mandelson and basically propelled him to one of the most significant positions in government, given everything that the Prime Minister was shown. Mark, there will be serious questions about how Keir Starmer pressed ahead with this appointment, given in black and white it showed he was taking hospitality from somebody in jail, and his most senior foreign affairs advisor was issuing warnings, but was apparently ignored.
OK, Sam, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in the political commentator, Adam Bolton. Good evening, Adam. So, Keir Starmer claimed he was lied to, but the due diligence report didn't lie to him. It's right there, as Sam was just saying, in black and white. Mandelson maintained ties to Epstein after he was convicted of procuring an underage girl and stayed at his house while he was in prison. Shouldn't that have been enough of a red flag?
Well, what we don't have are the specific questions which Peter Mandelson was asked about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the replies he gave to them. Now, those have been withheld because of the police inquiry, and certainly a lot of the Prime Minister's defence and the defence we heard today from Darren Jones is based on that, saying that they were lied to. Now, clearly, a lot of people are saying, well, bearing in mind what the Prime Minister knew at the time, as you say, about his staying at Epstein's house and his relation with Epstein, he shouldn't have given him the job. But it has to be said, all that was in the public domain by then. It had been reported in the Financial Times, JP Morgan's report saying that Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein had a close relationship was known. And the Prime Minister still went ahead to make the appointment. What wasn't known, of course, is what's come out of the various dumps from the Epstein files about the closeness of the relationship, about a financial relationship with Peter Mandelson and his partner, his husband, and also about the passing of government documents when he was one of Gordon Brown's cabinet ministers to Epstein. None of that was known. So really, what we have here today simply describes what we knew happened, that the Prime Minister took a gamble in approaching a risk in appointing Peter Mandelson because he thought he would be good at doing the job. And as Sam's just been saying, what is interesting is we're now seeing that there was some pretty high-level advice that maybe he ought to be rather cautious about making this appointment, particularly from Jonathan Powell, who had been of course, under Tony Blair, the Chief of Staff, the same job that Morgan McSweeney was doing for the Prime Minister, who also, as one of the key architects of the new Labour project, knew Peter Mandelson very well, and actually saying, you know, I've got my doubts. And what's more, the head of the Foreign Office then, Sir Philip Barton, had his doubts, and the Prime Minister overruled them. So the decision to appoint Mandelson is now resting firmly on the Prime Minister, and given that it went disastrously wrong because of those subsequent revelations, he'll have to face up to them. But, you know, as I say, this really confirms what we knew. It doesn't really make it worse.
No, but yeah, you were talking about Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell thought it was weirdly rushed. But let's just going back to what you were saying about Darren Jones, let's just have a listen, Adam, to what Darren Jones, Chief Secretary of the Prime Minister, had to say today, or a bit of it.
Whilst the documents point to public reports of an ongoing relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, the advice did not expose the depth and extent of their relationship, which only became apparent after the release of further files by Bloomberg and then the United States Department for Justice. After the Prime Minister reviewed the Cabinet Office due diligence that noted public reporting on Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, questions were put to Peter Mandelson by advisers in number 10, as Right Honourable and Honourable members can see referred to on pages 8 and 94 of the bundle, and Peter Mandelson responded. These are matters that are currently the subject of an ongoing police investigation, and we will publish this document when the investigation allows. When we do, the House will be able to see Peter Mandelson's answers for themselves, which the Prime Minister regrets believing. Peter Mandelson should never have been afforded the privilege of representing this country. And I reiterate for the House that the Prime Minister deeply regrets taking him at his word. It was a mistake to do so.
Now, this goes to what you were saying, Adam, about the question and answer session, if you like, between Keir Starmer and Mandelson. Those documents are being withheld because of the police investigation. But is it your view that number 10 would seem to think that there may be something in that that would put a different gloss on this? And I suppose the second part of that question is, do we even need those, given what's in the due diligence report and in the JP Morgan report, which some of the due diligence report was based on?
Well, with hindsight, everyone, including Darren Jones, accepted that Peter Mandelson should never have been appointed. But that is, as he made clear, because of the revelations coming out of the Epstein files. And, you know, the clear implication of what he was saying there was that Peter Mandelson was not straightforward with with the government about his relationship with Epstein. And if it emerges, for example, that one of the questions was, have you ever had a commercial relationship with Epstein? And Peter Mandelson says no. When we now have allegedly in the Epstein files proof that both he and his partner took money from Epstein as well as favours in terms of holidays and flights and things, that would be extremely damaging. That would be an example of why the Prime Minister has repeatedly said he was lied to. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but I think what the government is saying is, yes, people may think now that we were wrong on the basis of what we knew then to appoint Mandelson, but actually the really, the worst stuff which has come out subsequently about the closeness of the relationship, we didn't know. And what's more, we asked Peter Mandelson whether he would declare it, and he clearly didn't. So they're saying they were misled.
Now, I mean, some people would say, and I think it was also mentioned in the Commons, that, Mandelson was a known liar, and Keir Starmer is always proudly telling us he was the chief prosecutor in the country, perhaps should have spotted those lies. But I just want to hear from Kemi Badenoch, who's also been speaking, the opposition leader.
This is yet another indictment of Keir Starmer's judgment. He wants to make this all about Peter Mandelson asking for money. The fact is, he wouldn't have been paying out that severance package if he hadn't appointed him in the first place. And the vetting that we have now seen, the documents that we have now seen, have shown that the Prime Minister should never have made this decision. He has not been honest with the country. He's not been honest with Parliament about what he knew. Now he's complaining about the severance package, but the fact is he's the one who signed it off in the first place. I think that Keir Starmer is a man who is in office but not in power. He is held hostage by his backbenchers, and they can see right now that as much as the Prime Minister wanted to make this about Peter Mandelson, this is really about Keir Starmer being dishonest with them, with the country, with Parliament about what he knew. There are not enough Conservative MPs to remove the Prime Minister. He won a landslide. I think Labour MPs now need to consider their conscience and their position and ask if this man is fit to run our country.
So, Adam, just to wrap this up, what are your thoughts on Mandelson asking for £500,000 in the first place? That's on the severance pay. And then, to conclude, I wonder what sort of trouble you think Starmer is in as a result of these documents being released.
Well, to answer the first question, Peter Mandelson, these documents further damage Peter Mandelson's reputation. I mean, about half of this book is taken up, in fact, with sort of HR communications, first of all, about appointing him to the job and what benefits he would have, and then about his redundancy payment, effectively, when he was sacked by the Prime Minister. And to ask for £500,000 in those circumstances, I think, would strike everyone as the height of cheek, and then to accept £75,000, which was much less, of course, but still a very significant number, also will shock a lot of people. Although, it's important to note that Peter Mandelson has, been substantially ruined by his fall from grace, and that a number of people, particularly those people who work for him at Global Council, have also been financially ruined. So the consequences of his behaviour are shocking indeed, and he still doesn't seem to, really be cognizant of just how wrong his behaviour has been over quite a long period in relation to Epstein. Although I have to say, I don't think anyone knew until those documents revealed the Epsteins and communications with Epstein, the extent of what he'd done wrong. As far as Sir Keir Starmer is concerned, I don't think anything in this document today makes his situation any worse than it was before, because the information known about Peter Mandelson was all there, and he was advised that there was a general reputational risk from appointing Peter Mandelson, but because of his trade experience, his political experience, he took that gamble, which has now gone drastically wrong. I think the jury is really out now and we don't have the evidence, and we won't until the criminal process is concerned, as to whether, as you say, a man who had been the nation's top prosecutor really did do proper due diligence of Peter Mandelson's background on the basis of what we know now and what clearly Peter Mandelson was covering up.
OK, Adam, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you in the next hour. Thanks very much indeed.